Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning. Story 1. The God on Earth, Divine Authority in Early Dynastic Egypt. Imagine the hot stillness of the Nile Valley around 3100 BCE. Dust rises from the banks of the river as peasants harvest papyrus, unaware that just a few miles away, a new political invention is taking root that will define kingship for over 3 millennia. In the heart of what would later be called Lower Egypt, a man named Narmer, or perhaps Menes, depending on which archaeological shard you believe, unifies the two lands of Egypt and claims something unprecedented, that he rules not just for the gods, but as one. This idea, deceptively simple in its presentation, marked a turning point in the history of human governance. The divine ruler was not merely a strong man. He was a conceptual leap, a bridge between the sacred and the mundane, the cosmic and the earthly. And unlike tribal leaders or warlords of neighboring cultures, the Egyptian king, eventually titled Nesubit, was considered the literal living embodiment of divine power. But how did this belief emerge? The birth of divine kingship. The earliest kings of Egypt did not yet enjoy fully formed divine status. In the pre-dynastic period, before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, leadership was often linked to clan loyalty and military prowess. Burials from this era in places like Nakata and Abydos suggest a society stratifying quickly, but still grounded in earthly status. With Narmer's supposed unification, however, came more than administrative centralization. It also ushered in an ideological revolution. Narmer's famous palette, an intricately carved slab discovered at Hierakonpolis, shows him smiting enemies, wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. But more interesting is the symbolism. Towering above mortals, Narmer is shown larger than life, attended by supernatural animals and divine insignias. This was not just artistic bravado, it was theology. Kingship became a sacred office. Narmer and those who followed were no longer merely powerful, they were, in a profound and almost bureaucratically literal sense, gods. He of the sedge and the bee. Over time, this idea became codified in titles. The dual title Nesubit, meaning he of the sedge and the bee, symbolized control over Upper and Lower Egypt, but also connected the pharaoh to natural symbols of divine harmony. The pharaoh was lord of the two lands, but also son of Ra, later living Horus, and ultimately the good god. Each of these titles layered the king with religious gravitas. In effect, the Egyptian king was a theological hybrid, mortal in body, divine in function. He maintained Maat, the cosmic order, which included overseeing agriculture, flood cycles, temple rituals, and justice. If the king failed, the cosmos itself could unravel. This wasn't metaphor, it was policy. Sacred administration. Egyptian bureaucracy served this theology. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were administrative centers. Scribes, priests, and tax collectors all operated under the theological premise that the king was a divine agent. Every grain stored, every tablet written, and every ritual performed validated the king's divine status. The earliest pyramids, particularly Djoser's Step Pyramid at Saqqara, served not only as tombs but also as spiritual infrastructure. The belief was that the king's soul, the Ka, would continue governing in the afterlife, ensuring eternal Maat. Mortuary temples next to pyramids remained active long after the ruler's death, with priests feeding statues and chanting spells, as if the pharaoh were still alive. In a real sense, divine kingship meant the king never truly died. His cult endured, sometimes for centuries. The human cost of divinity. Yet this ideal came with a cost, one rarely discussed in sweeping historical narratives. Thousands of laborers were conscripted to build temples and tombs. Though not slaves in the traditional sense, they lived harsh lives. Ostraca, fragments of limestone or pottery used as writing surfaces, Recovered from workers' villages like Deir el-Medina record injuries, poor rations, and disputes. For these laborers, divine kingship was not abstract, it was grueling, and their participation in the religious state apparatus, though compulsory, was necessary. Without their work, the king could not complete his sacred mission. Without his mission, the Nile might not flood. Without the flood, crops would fail. And without crops, famine and chaos isfit, the opposite of Ma'at, would reign. A divine monopoly. Unlike the pantheons of Mesopotamia, where priest-kings served the gods but were not themselves divine, Egypt's ruler monopolized the sacred. Only the king could truly commune with the gods. Even high priests required royal sanction. Temples bore inscriptions crediting the king with every ritual, regardless of who physically performed it. This theological exclusivity had long-term implications. It reinforced centralized control, made religious dissent treasonous, and fostered a bureaucracy whose survival depended on upholding the king's divine status. It also made succession delicate. Who, after all, could inherit divinity? The solution was genealogical, divine right through bloodline. But as we will see in later sections, this too was not always so simple. Fragments from Abydos, mortuary politics. Abydos, one of the earliest religious centers of Egypt, housed some of the first royal tombs. These tombs are simple compared to later pyramids, but their symbolic importance is vast. Early kings were buried with dozens, sometimes hundreds of retainers, many of whom may have been sacrificed to serve their master in the afterlife. This practice raises uncomfortable questions. Was divine kingship so convincing that people willingly died to serve a dead god-king? Or were these early expressions of state power coercive, cloaked in religious necessity? We may never know, but the cemeteries tell a clear story. Belief and control were intertwined. The Eternal Est Festival. To maintain his image of vitality and divine vigor, the king participated in the Est Festival, a rejuvenation ceremony held after 30 years of rule. The rituals involved running a symbolic race, receiving homage, and reasserting the king's role as the embodiment of Ma'at. This ceremony was so important that some kings simulated it on monuments even if they hadn't ruled 30 years. It was not about physical reality, but cosmic narrative. The appearance of divine strength mattered more than truth. And in Egypt, divine illusion was truth. The question of belief. Did the Egyptian people truly believe their king was a god? The evidence suggests yes, but not in the simplistic sense we might assume. Belief in divine kingship wasn't blind obedience. It was embedded in daily rituals, economic systems, education, and the very architecture of society. To challenge it would mean unraveling the fabric of life itself. Even so, traces of doubt and subversion linger in forgotten graffiti and later reforms. But that is a story for another section. Unresolved thought. If the earliest pharaohs built their power on the appearance of godhood, what happens when that image begins to crack? You are standing in the heart of ancient Memphis. The smell of burning incense drifts through the air. The priests chant, their voices echoing off limestone walls as they pour water offerings onto altars dedicated to the living god-king. Yet not far from these sanctified halls, there are murmurs, grumblings in the fields, quiet disputes in village councils. The king may be divine, but his divinity cannot silence hunger, end drought, or fix every administrative failure. The illusion of divine kingship was powerful, but it was not infallible, and it was not eternal. As Egypt transitioned from the Old Kingdom into the First Intermediate Period, c. 2181–2055 BCE, the image of the all-powerful, ever-living king began to falter. Famines, decentralization, and political chaos exposed the structural weaknesses beneath centuries of theological certainty. This section explores the slow unraveling of that image, not in a cataclysmic fall, but in quiet erosion. The Pyramid Age ends when the stones stopped rising. The Old Kingdom is often remembered for the grandeur of its pyramids monuments like Khufu's Great Pyramid at Giza, colossal in ambition and execution. These structures were not merely tombs, but cosmic beacons. Each stone reinforced the pharaoh's eternal link to the gods. But as the Sixth Dynasty waned, so too did the resources and political unity needed to support such endeavors. By the time of Pepi II, who may have ruled for over 90 years, the state was stretched thin. Nomarchs, regional governors, gained increasing autonomy, collecting taxes locally and amassing power that rivaled the royal court. Tomb inscriptions from these nomarchs begin to adopt royal-like rhetoric, even divine associations, an unmistakable sign that power was diffusing. Worse still, the central government could no longer maintain irrigation networks or manage Nile floods effectively. The sacred connection between king and natural order was strained. When the Nile failed to flood adequately, the land starved. The living God was suddenly very mortal in the eyes of his people. First Intermediate Period, the silence of the divine. From roughly 2181 BCE, Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of fragmentation. There were no more giant pyramids. Royal inscriptions became sparse. Local warlords and rival kings emerged in cities like Heracleopolis and Thebes. And in the absence of strong centralized rule, something fascinating happened. Local rulers began to insert themselves into the divine narrative. Some took on royal titles, others claimed to protect Maat themselves. The divine monopoly of kingship was, for the first time, open to competitors. Literary works from this period, such as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, describe societal breakdown. The poor man has become rich, and the noble has nothing. Whether exaggeration or reality, the poem reflects a worldview in which divine kingship had lost its luster. The gods no longer seemed to favor the pharaoh. Cosmic order was no longer guaranteed. The democratization of the afterlife. Perhaps the most profound theological shift of the period came in death. Previously, only the pharaoh was guaranteed an afterlife alongside the gods. He alone possessed the necessary spells and rituals carved into tomb walls and sarcophagi that would allow his soul to ascend and join the solar bark of Ra. But during the First Intermediate Period and into the Middle Kingdom, funerary texts began appearing in non-royal tombs. Coffin texts, precursors to the famed Book of the Dead, extended divine knowledge to commoners and officials alike. The afterlife was no longer exclusive. And if anyone could now reach the afterlife, did that not also mean that the king was not so unique, not so divine? The ramifications of this shift were enormous. Divine kingship had been built on exclusivity. Now, that sacred distance was narrowing. Middle Kingdom restoration, reinventing the sacred state. Around 2055 BCE, a Theban prince named Mentuhotep II succeeded in reuniting Egypt under a centralized government, launching the Middle Kingdom. This dynasty worked hard to re-establish the prestige and theology of kingship, but the scars of the previous era remained. Rather than rely solely on towering monuments, the Middle Kingdom kings emphasized their roles as shepherds of the people. Their inscriptions show concern for justice, law, and the well-being of the land. They promoted the ideal of the just king, Sematoi, one who balanced Maat, not through raw divinity, but through wise governance. In this way, kingship remained sacred, but it was evolving. Temples grew in number, new rituals emerged, but the idea that the king was above all others, metaphysically untouchable, had shifted subtly. Now he was divine not by default, but by action. The limits of monuments, the case of Senusret II. Senusret III, one of the most powerful kings of the Middle Kingdom, took kingship reform to new heights. His statues portray him with furrowed brows, large ears, and a tired face very unlike the serene, ageless images of Old Kingdom rulers. This was not an aesthetic failure. It was political philosophy. Senusret was portraying himself as burdened by kingship, a king who listened, hence the large ears, and a ruler shaped by struggle. Divine authority, it seemed, now required empathy. This change in artistic tone was revolutionary. It implied that the king's power came not solely from heaven, but from his care for the nation. The story of Ankhtifi, a forgotten voice in the desert. One of the most remarkable documents from this era is the tomb inscription of Ankhtifi, a nomarch from Hierakonpolis. Writing during the height of the First Intermediate Period, Ankhtifi boasts that while others starved, he fed his people. While chaos reigned, he maintained order. He even describes himself in cosmic terms. I am the breath of the nostrils of all the people. This is the language once reserved for kings. Ankhtifi's inscription reminds us that divine kingship was not just theology, it was performance, perception, and political theater. And when the central king failed to play the part, others stepped in. Faith and control, the fragile alliance. Throughout this era, temple building resumed, cults were revived, and divine kingship was reimagined. But the cracks never fully disappeared. Priestly classes grew more powerful. Some temples like those of Amun at Karnak amassed land, wealth, and influence rivaling the royal court. As centuries passed, kings would increasingly rely on temple support for legitimacy, often marrying into priestly families or making lavish donations. But this created a feedback loop. The more kings depended on religious institutions, the less autonomous their divine identity became. The king was no longer the sole speaker with the gods, he now needed intermediaries, and intermediaries had agendas. A tension left unresolved. By the time the Middle Kingdom gave way to the New Kingdom, c. 1550 BCE, kings like Thutmose III and Amenhotep III would reclaim much of the grandeur of earlier dynasties. They would call themselves living Horus, build colossal temples, and expand Egyptian influence abroad. But the divine image was now carefully managed. Kingship had become a balancing act, part god, part man, part administrator, part warrior. It was still sacred, but it was no longer unquestioned. And lurking at the end of this evolution is the most radical experiment in divine rule Egypt ever saw. A king who claimed that not just he, but all other gods were false. Unresolved question. What happens when a divine king declares war on the entire pantheon that legitimized his rule? The sun blazes overhead in the arid expanse of Middle Egypt. There, in a city carved from dust and vision, a man named Akhenaten walks barefoot across freshly consecrated ground. He lifts his face to the sun, the Aten, and praises the god not with ancient prayers, but with a hymn of his own creation. There are no towering gods with animal heads, no secret rites performed by cloaked priests, no ancient texts chanted in temple halls. Only the sun disk, only light. And only the king. Welcome to Akhetaten, a city that existed for barely 2 decades, yet shattered 3,000 years of religious tradition. This section closes our first story by examining the most extreme and ultimately fatal attempt to redefine divine kingship in ancient Egypt. Akhenaten's radical reign challenged every institution that had supported pharaonic rule. In doing so, he revealed just how fragile the illusion of divine power could be. Amenhotep IV becomes Akhenaten. Before he became the so-called heretic king, Akhenaten was born Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III, a powerful pharaoh who oversaw one of Egypt's most prosperous periods. The elder Amenhotep was a master of symbolism and divine diplomacy, styling himself as a god-king beloved of Amun, the chief deity of the Theban priesthood. His son, however, inherited not just wealth and influence, but also tensions. The cult of Amun had grown immensely powerful, owning vast tracts of land and rivaling the king in authority. Priests of Amun could dictate policy, interpret omens, and command public loyalty in ways that subtly undermined royal supremacy. Faced with this reality, Amenhotep IV took a drastic step. He rejected Amun entirely. Then he went further. He rejected all the gods except one. The rise of the Aten. Akhenaten's preferred deity was not new. The Aten, the sun disk, had existed for centuries as a minor aspect of the sun god Ra. But Akhenaten elevated the Aten into something different, a universal, abstract, formless divinity. It had no mythology, no personality, no temples with hidden sanctuaries. It was light, truth, energy, and it needed only one interpreter on earth, Akhenaten himself. In year 5 of his reign, he moved the royal court to a new capital, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, abandoning Thebes and its priestly establishment. He commissioned new art, new temples, and a new religious orthodoxy that made the king the sole intermediary between God and man. In this theology, there were no gods assisting the pharaoh. The king was the source of divine mediation. Without Akhenaten, there was no Aten. Without the Aten, there was no life. Rewriting the divine order. Akhenaten's reforms were sweeping. He ordered the defacement of Amun's name from temples and monuments across Egypt. Statues of traditional gods were smashed or removed. Even cartouches bearing the names of other deities were erased. His new temples were open-air structures, designed to let in sunlight, appropriate perhaps for a god of light, but deeply alien to Egyptian religious sensibilities, which prized darkness, mystery, and the hidden presence of the divine. And in official art, Akhenaten broke with all convention. He appeared elongated, with wide hips, a sagging belly, and an exaggerated skull. Some scholars suggest this was symbolic of divine androgyny. Others propose it was artistic stylization to set him apart. But regardless of the reason, the result was unmistakable. This king was not just different, he was other. Even his wife, Nefertiti, played an unusually prominent role in religious imagery, sometimes shown as nearly equal to the king. His daughters appeared in family scenes and intimate, almost domestic vignettes, another stark break from previous pharaonic tradition. This was not merely a new religion. It was a new ideology of kingship, one where divinity flowed from the king, not toward him. The cost of revolution. But while Akhenaten basked in the spiritual light of the Aten, the rest of Egypt suffered in the shadows. With the traditional priesthood defanged, temples that once served as social and economic hubs fell into disrepair. Grain stores managed by religious officials were disrupted. Local rituals ceased. The vast infrastructure that had tied the king to the common people through festivals, feasts, and sacrifices was gone. Foreign policy also declined. Vassal states in Canaan and Syria, long reliant on Egyptian oversight, sent desperate letters now known as the Amarna letters begging for support. Many went unanswered. Egypt's empire began to slip away. Within Egypt, resentment simmered. The priests of Amun, though suppressed, did not forget. The populace, deprived of their familiar gods and rituals, grew alienated. Akhenaten's theology was too abstract, too elitist. It was a cult of one man's vision, imposed on a country built on continuity. The mystery of Smenkhkare and the transition. As Akhenaten's health declined, the royal court entered a phase of confusion. A figure named Smenkhkare, possibly his co-regent, brother, or even wife Nefertiti under another name, briefly appeared, then vanished. Power shifted rapidly. Factions emerged. One man stood on the sidelines, watching, a boy named Tutankhaten. The return to the old gods. Tutankhaten, likely Akhenaten's son or close relative, ascended the throne at around 9 years old. Almost immediately, his advisors began undoing Akhenaten's reforms. The boy king's name was changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. The court returned to Thebes. Temples were reopened. Amun was restored to his former glory. Official records soon referred to Akhenaten's reign as the time of the enemy. His city, Akhetaten, was abandoned, left to decay in the desert winds. Statues were smashed, names erased, memories condemned. The experiment was over. Why did it fail? Akhenaten's failure was not due to theological implausibility. Monotheism, or something like it, had deep appeal, but he misunderstood or ignored the social function of religion in Egypt. The king's divinity had always rested on a partnership with the gods, priests, and people. It was theatrical, yes, but it was also participatory. By removing the traditional gods and disbanding their cults, Akhenaten removed the scaffolding that made kingship sacred. He declared himself a god, but a god without a chorus, without worshippers, without infrastructure. And a god alone is no god at all. The legacy of Akhenaten. Ironically, Akhenaten's heresy made him unforgettable. While other pharaohs faded into obscurity, his reign left a historical footprint so bizarre, so dramatic, that modern scholars obsess over it. Some call him the first monotheist. Others view him as a proto-totalitarian. Some see a tragic visionary, others see a deluded tyrant. But one thing is clear. Akhenaten revealed the limitations of divine kingship. Strip away the rituals, temples, and priesthood, and kingship becomes fragile. Sacred power, once thought eternal, relies on belief, and belief must be cultivated. Divine kingship after Akhenaten. Future pharaohs learned from his failure. The Ramesside kings, like Ramesses II, emphasized tradition, martial power, and devotion to the gods. They built colossal monuments to Amun, revived priestly hierarchies, and erased Akhenaten's name wherever they could. And yet the memory of Akhenaten lingered. His radical vision, though buried, had planted a seed of theological doubt. If one king could undo millennia of belief, how permanent was any divine order? The aftermath: kings, priests, and the long decline. In later centuries, particularly during the Third Intermediate Period and into the Late Period, divine kingship became increasingly ceremonial. Real power often lay with high priests, foreign governors, or military leaders. The king remained divine, but in many cases he was a puppet of deeper forces. Eventually, Egypt would fall under Persian, then Macedonian, then Roman rule. Each of these foreign regimes adopted and adapted the image of the divine king. But by the time of Cleopatra VII, divine kingship had become diplomatic theater rather than religious truth. Cleopatra herself, claiming to be Isis incarnate, played the role of the sacred monarch. But her suicide in 30 BCE marked the final end of pharaonic rule, and with it, the last breath of divine kingship in Egypt. A reflection, the invention and unraveling of godhood. From Narmer to Akhenaten, from pyramid builders to boy kings, Egypt's divine rulers forged a unique model of kingship, one in which political power, cosmic order, and personal identity merged into a singular institution. But the story of divine kingship in Egypt also reveals its greatest vulnerability. It was only as strong as people's willingness to believe. Ritual, art, language, and statecraft all supported the illusion. Without them, even the mightiest god-kings were just men. In the end, divine kingship was a mirror reflecting the hopes, fears, and structures of a society that needed to believe someone could stand between them and the chaos of the world. Final reflection. In Egypt, the king ruled as a god, but as we shall see in other empires, kings would soon begin to rule by the will of gods, not as them. What happens when divinity becomes delegated, not embodied? Story 2: Heavenly Law and River Floods, the reign of Pharaoh Djoser. The early morning sun begins to rise over the desert plateau of Saqqara. The light cuts through the haze of dust and heat, illuminating a structure that does not quite belong to its time. It is not a hut, nor a mastaba tomb. It is not merely a temple. It is, by all surviving evidence, the first monumental stone building in human history. 6-stepped layers of limestone rise toward the sky, a pyramid not quite the perfect, smooth-sided kind we associate with Giza, but a prototype. This is the step pyramid of Djoser. It is a structure that represents far more than a tomb. It marks the crystallization of an idea, that the pharaoh, once a sacred figure among many, had now become the physical foundation of eternity. And behind this transformation stood not only the king but his brilliant vizier, Imhotep. This section explores how Djoser's reign redefined divine kingship by grounding it literally in stone, law, and the manipulation of the natural world. The pyramid would become the visible proof that the king could impose order over chaos, even in death. A world of clay and reed. To understand the leap made under Djoser, we must first understand what came before. In the early dynastic period, c. 3100–2686 BCE, most royal tombs were made of mud brick, durable but perishable, practical but uninspired. They were mastabas, low, rectangular structures that housed the deceased and marked the beginning of formal royal burial practices. These mastabas, while significant, were still rooted in the traditions of earlier tribal burials. They suggested continuity, not revolution. But Djoser's reign broke with tradition. It reached upward. It sought permanence. And permanence in ancient Egypt meant more than legacy, it meant control over Mad, the sacred balance of the universe. Djoser, the king and the flood. Djoser ruled during Egypt's third dynasty, a time when the country was still solidifying after centuries of experimentation with kingship and bureaucracy. His Horus name, Netjerikhet, means divine of the body, a telling clue to how he was perceived. One of the most enduring stories from his reign comes not from his pyramid, but from a legend etched in stone centuries later, during the Ptolemaic period, the famine stela on the island of Sehel near Aswan. It tells of a 7-year famine during Djoser's reign, during which the Nile failed to flood. In desperation, Djoser seeks counsel from Imhotep, who in turn consults the sacred texts and deities. The solution: appease Khnum, the god of the Nile's source, by restoring his temple. Once this is done, the river returns. The story is not historical fact, it's a retrospective myth, but it encapsulates something true. Djoser's reign was associated with divine order, the harnessing of nature, and the foundational role of the king in securing survival. In this story, Djoser does not merely pray for the flood, he negotiates with the gods. He acts as Egypt's cosmic administrator. Imhotep, the mind behind the stone. Djoser's power may have been divine, but it was Imhotep who gave that power form. Imhotep, a commoner by birth, rose to become Djoser's chancellor, high priest of Ra, and the architect of the step pyramid. His reputation was so great that later Egyptians worshipped him as a god of medicine and wisdom. His innovation at Saqqara was staggering. He took the mastaba form and extended it upward, layer by layer, until it became a 6-tiered pyramid, something no one had ever attempted. But this was not just about height. It was about material. The step pyramid was built entirely of limestone, quarried, transported, and stacked in precise blocks. This choice was both technical and symbolic. Stone was eternal. Unlike mud brick, it would not erode or collapse. It was the perfect medium for a king whose soul needed to last forever. Imhotep's architectural complex included chapels, courts, ceremonial buildings, and a surrounding wall with fake doors, possibly to serve the king's spirit in the afterlife. It was a city of stone, built for one man's divine presence after death. This fusion of architecture, religion, and royal ideology was unprecedented. The pyramid as theology. What did the pyramid mean to those who saw it? It was not just a tomb, it was a theological statement. Its vertical layers echoed the primordial mound, Benben, from which creation emerged in Egyptian cosmology. It symbolized the king's ascension, his climb to join the gods. Each stone layer reflected a step closer to divinity, and each step was made possible by human hands: engineers, masons, laborers working not for wages, but for cosmic duty. Even in death, the king maintained Mad. The pyramid ensured it. The cult of the King's Ka. Djoser's death did not end his reign, not in the spiritual sense. Like earlier pharaohs, he was believed to live on through his Ka, or life force, which required sustenance in the form of rituals and offerings. The mortuary temple attached to the step pyramid became a place of ongoing ritual. Priests served there in perpetuity, feeding the king's spirit, reciting hymns, and maintaining the cosmic link between the dead pharaoh and the living world. This cult of the dead king would become a standard feature of later dynasties, but under Djoser, it found its first full expression. Divine kingship was now anchored not only in ritual but in a permanent architectural framework. Economic and administrative expansion. To support such a grand project, Djoser's administration had to evolve. Records suggest that under his rule, Egypt's central bureaucracy expanded, especially in terms of resource allocation. Quarrying limestone on such a scale required labor coordination, transport logistics, and provisioning. Even rudimentary census efforts may have been conducted to calculate how many workers and how much grain were needed to sustain the effort. Thus, the step pyramid was not just a monument to theology, it was a testament to administration. The king's ability to command such a project reinforced his divine status in the eyes of his subjects. A god could shape the earth, a god could move mountains, and Djoser had done both. Legacy in stone and story. Djoser's reign set a precedent that would define the Old Kingdom. Later kings Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre would all follow his model, building bigger and smoother pyramids. But none of it would have been possible without the conceptual leap that Djoser and Imhotep made. By stepping beyond mudbrick, by elevating the tomb into a celestial statement, they changed kingship itself. They also changed memory. Djoser became a figure of reverence long after his death. His name was remembered even in late periods when most other kings of his era had been forgotten. The pyramid complex itself remained a sacred site for millennia. The king who mastered the floods had, in a way, mastered time. The quiet builders. And yet, as with all divine feats, there is a hidden layer of human cost. The step pyramid required the labor of thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. Though Egyptian ideology saw this labor as sacred service, the practical reality was brutal. Workers lived in temporary settlements, faced dangerous conditions, and endured years of physical hardship. They remain unnamed in the historical record. But without them, the divine king's step into eternity would never have happened. An incomplete mystery. Despite centuries of excavation, the burial chamber beneath the step pyramid remains partially sealed. Djoser's actual mummy has never been definitively identified. Like many Egyptian tombs, his final resting place may have been looted or disturbed. But in a way, that doesn't matter. His pyramid still rises from the sand. His name still echoes through stone. His vision, forged in limestone and legend, still shapes our image of what a god-king looks like. Unresolved question. If the pyramid made the king eternal, what happens when eternity itself begins to crumble? You walk through the ruined courtyards of Saqqara under the slow heat of mid-morning. Around you rise the walls of a long-abandoned complex walls that once echoed with sacred chants and the hushed footsteps of priests. This was not just a tomb. It was not just a statement of divine power in stone. It was a machine of eternity, carefully engineered to maintain cosmic balance through ritual, law, and divine presence. In the last section, we explored how Pharaoh Djoser and his architect Imhotep pioneered a radical new model of divine kingship through the construction of the step pyramid. But monumental architecture was only one layer. Beneath the limestone was something more enduring, a political and religious logic that tied the king's body, the flooding Nile, the rituals of the temple, and the fate of Egypt into one cohesive system. This section will dive deeper into how Djoser institutionalized kingship not just through temples and pyramids, but through his control of natural and divine systems. Here, the king emerges not only as the chosen of the gods, but as a manager of heaven and earth, ruling by predictability, order, and continuity. The flood as a calendar and covenant. To understand Djoser's significance, one must grasp the central role of the Nile flood in Egyptian life. Each year between July and October, the river would rise and spill its nutrient-rich silt across the land. This annual inundation was both feared and revered. It could bring abundance or famine. The Egyptian calendar itself was structured around it. Akhit, inundation; Paret, emergence; and Shemu, harvest. In this system, Djoser was not merely a political figure. He was necessary. Egyptian theology taught that it was the pharaoh's favor with the gods, especially Khnum, who controlled the Nile's source, that ensured the river would flood properly. If the flood failed, the king's legitimacy could be called into question. That is why the legend recorded in the famine stela, though written 2,000 years after Djoser lived, makes theological sense. In it, Djoser is portrayed as a priest-king negotiating with Khnum on behalf of his starving people, restoring proper worship in exchange for the river's return. It is propaganda, yes, but it is also a covenantal model of rule, in which the king is the intercessor between a chaotic nature and a people who depend on cosmic stability. The temple economy and ritual control. The Step Pyramid complex wasn't just a mortuary space, it was the nucleus of a growing temple economy. As Djoser consolidated power, temples began functioning like state-run estates. They collected tithes, owned farmland, employed priests and artisans, and redistributed food and goods. They were economic engines as much as sacred spaces. Djoser's expansion of this system, especially through temple construction at Heliopolis and Elephantine, created a theological infrastructure where offerings and rituals were managed centrally, reinforcing the king's role as the guarantor of Maat. For example, priests performed daily rituals that symbolically fed the king's Ka, renewed his divine authority, and reenacted creation myths. These rituals had economic implications requiring bread, beer, meat, incense, and linen, all of which came from temple lands worked by peasants under state control. Divine kingship was not just ceremony, it was supply chain. Codifying divine justice, Maat and the king's court. The king was not only expected to ensure good harvests and flooding, he was the ultimate judge, a living embodiment of Maat truth, balance, and order. Under Djoser, evidence suggests that judicial practices became more formalized. While we lack specific legal codes from his reign, later Middle Kingdom texts attribute early legal structure to the Third Dynasty. Djoser would have been seen as the source of all justice, delegating authority to viziers and scribes, but always maintaining final divine oversight. In this light, Imhotep's dual role as both vizier and high priest makes more sense. He wasn't just an architect. He was the king's extension in matters of theology and law, a custodian of Maat in administrative form. And the architecture itself reflected this order. The Step Pyramid complex was not random, it was meticulously planned. Its symmetry, orientation, and enclosed space reflected a worldview in which order triumphed over chaos. Pilgrimage, procession, and the ritual life of the pyramid. The Step Pyramid wasn't a static monument, it was alive with ritual. The enclosure wall of the complex included 14 fake doors, symbolizing multiple realities or dimensions through which the king's spirit might pass. Only one entrance was real, suggesting control over transition, access, and power. The complex also included a large court for the Est Festival, a jubilee celebrated in theory every 30 years to rejuvenate the king's power. Whether Djoser ever held a Est Festival is unclear, but the space for it was carved in stone, implying either a real or symbolic performance of eternal kingship. Visitors, whether priests or pilgrims, would have participated in processions, bringing offerings and reenacting the king's sacred role in the cosmos. Every ritual was part of a system that maintained divine kingship not just in the present, but in perpetuity. In effect, the pyramid became a ritual calendar in stone, engineering control over death. Perhaps the most profound transformation of Djoser's reign was the re-engineering of death. Before the step pyramid, burial was a transition into the underworld fraught with danger and uncertainty. Tombs were protective, not performative, but Djoser's complex reversed this. His tomb was not hidden, it was celebrated. Its prominence shouted that death was not the end, but the crowning moment of kingship. Ritual texts inscribed in the subterranean chambers prepared the king for rebirth. In fact, some Egyptologists believe the step pyramid was designed as a stairway to the heavens, helping the king ascend to the gods. This view reshaped Egyptian funerary culture. Later pyramids, tombs, and even the Book of the Dead would all build upon this foundation. Where once death was a shadowy realm to be feared, Djoser made it a system to be managed. Imhotep's apotheosis, the legacy of a man among gods. Centuries after Djoser's death, his name remained linked with divine kingship. But Imhotep's legacy became something else entirely. He was deified. By the late period, Imhotep had temples in his honor, was worshipped as a son of Ptah, the creator god, and was invoked in healing rituals. Greek sources equated him with Asclepius, the god of medicine. This divine elevation of a non-royal official is nearly unique in Egyptian history. Imhotep's apotheosis was not just a reward for architectural genius. It was a recognition that knowledge, not just bloodline, could shape the sacred state. His role under Djoser had shown that the mechanisms of divine kingship were human-engineered, planned, and preserved through rational systems. In a subtle way, Imhotep's worship suggests that beneath the sacred aura of the king lay the practical hands of people like him, planners, organizers, visionaries. Cracks in the limestone, a question of permanence. Despite the power and beauty of the step pyramid, time has not been kind. By the end of the Old Kingdom, pyramids had become common, but their quality declined. The centralized state could no longer marshal the resources that Djoser once commanded. Pyramids became smaller, rougher. Tomb raiding became common. The vision of permanence began to erode. Djoser's model was strong, but it depended on economic surplus, ideological unity, and ritual maintenance. Without these, even stone could crumble. The pyramid and the people. One of the great silences of ancient Egyptian history is the voice of the ordinary person. We do not know how peasants felt about building a pyramid for a man they would never meet, whom they were told was a god. Perhaps they believed, perhaps they feared, perhaps they simply labored, trusting in the system or enduring it. But one truth remains. Their labor, their hands, sweat, and lives are in every stone. They built not just a monument, but an ideology. Djoser may have ruled from the divine heights, but it was ordinary people who gave his eternity form. Unresolved question. If Djoser and Imhotep defined what kingship could be, what happens when future rulers fail to live up to that vision? The late afternoon sun casts long shadows over the stone steps of Saqqara. The sand creeps slowly over carved limestone blocks, whispering against half-buried walls. The step pyramid still stands, weathered but immovable, an ancient promise in a world of change. But behind this eternal symbol of divine kingship lies a more fragile truth, that power, no matter how sacred, is always vulnerable to erosion. In this final section on Djoser, we trace the legacy he left not only in monuments, but in the institutions and ideologies that shaped the Old Kingdom. We explore how his model of divine kingship influenced later rulers, but also how that very model began to fray under the weight of ambition, corruption, and the realities of nature and human frailty. Here, we see how Djoser's greatest gift, his redefinition of what it meant to be a god on earth, carried with it the seeds of both imperial greatness and imperial decline. From stone steps to smooth pyramids, the imitators. Djoser's step pyramid set a precedent no Egyptian king could ignore. His immediate successors, rulers like Sekhemkhet and Kaba, attempted similar constructions, though none reached the scale or success of Imhotep's design. Most of their pyramids remain unfinished or poorly preserved, testaments to the difficulty of repeating Djoser's feat without his brilliant architect. Then came Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, who built not one but 3 pyramids, including the Red Pyramid and the famous Bent Pyramid at Dahshur. His son, Khufu, built the Great Pyramid at Giza, the largest and most precise stone structure in human history. But by then, something had shifted. Where Djoser's complex had emphasized ritual, architecture, and sacred performance, these later pyramids began to emphasize scale. They were larger, more imposing, but also more removed from the participatory rituals that once defined divine kingship. The king had become distant, still divine, but increasingly abstract. Administrative complexity and the centralization of power. Djoser's vision had required a massive leap in bureaucratic sophistication. To quarry, transport, and organize the construction of his pyramid complex, Egypt had to mobilize vast networks of officials, laborers, and resource managers. This early administrative expansion continued into the Fourth and Fifth Dynasties. Egypt developed a cadre of scribes, overseers, and regional governors known as nomarchs who reported to the royal court. Initially, this system served divine kingship well. It allowed the king to enact cosmic will through practical governance. But over time, it created a class of elites whose wealth and influence began to rival the king's own. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, these nomarchs often acted autonomously, passing down positions within families and managing local cults independently. The king, though still divine in title, was losing the monopoly on power that Djoser had so carefully constructed. Erosion from within, pyramid decline, and provincial rise. As the Old Kingdom wore on, the once majestic pyramids began to shrink. By the Fifth and Sixth Dynasties, royal tombs were smaller, cruder, and more prone to collapse. Meanwhile, non-royal elites were building increasingly elaborate tombs, often with inscriptions detailing their own piety, achievements, and even prayers once reserved for the king. This was a subtle but profound shift. Djoser's pyramid had declared that only the king could ascend to eternity through monumental construction. But a few centuries later, the elite class began co-opting royal privileges. Texts like the pyramid texts, once exclusive to pharaohs, started appearing in elite tombs. The divine exclusivity that Djoser embodied was becoming democratized. The sacred order was thinning. The collapse of central authority. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, especially during the long reign of Pepi II, the centralized state began to unravel. As discussed in Story 1, regional governors amassed too much autonomy. Floods became irregular. Trade routes faltered. Mortuary temples were abandoned or looted. In this environment, divine kingship became hollow. What Djoser and Imhotep had crafted, a system of ritual, law, and architecture designed to project eternal authority, could not sustain itself without active belief and resource flow. When priests went unpaid, when rituals ceased, when pyramids crumbled, so too did the idea that the king was the axis of the universe. By the time Egypt entered the First Intermediate Period, divine kingship had fractured. Local rulers claimed spiritual authority. Temples fell into disuse. And yet, the memory of Djoser's system lingered like a golden age whose perfection had slipped just out of reach. The pyramid as a metaphor. Seen across centuries, Djoser's step pyramid becomes more than a tomb. It becomes a metaphor for kingship itself. Its broad base, composed of thousands of aligned stones, reflects the massive labor and bureaucratic apparatus needed to uphold the pharaoh's divinity. Its vertical ascent mirrors the ideological claim that the king could rise above the mortal plane, climbing into the sky to join the gods. But it is a fragile metaphor. When the base erodes through economic failure, elite infighting, or natural disaster, the structure becomes unstable. The steps cannot hold. The illusion begins to falter. That is what happened to Djozer's legacy. It rose brilliantly, defined an age, and then slowly crumbled, not because the idea was flawed, but because it depended on systems that were, in the end, all too human. Sacred time and human time. One of the great tensions in Egyptian kingship is the contrast between sacred time and human time. Djozer's complex was built to function eternally. Priests were assigned to serve his cult in perpetuity. Offerings were ritualized into the daily rhythms of Egypt's religious life. The king, though dead, was present every day in sacred time. But sacred time does not withstand grain shortages, political strife, or changing beliefs. The priests die, the temples decay, the rituals lose meaning. And so Djozer's eternity, though carved in stone, was always vulnerable to historical decay. Lessons from Djozer's reign. What then does Djoser teach us? He shows that divine kingship is not a given. It must be constructed brick by brick, ritual by ritual, law by law. It is not merely a belief system, but a full-spectrum political order that requires architecture, economy, theology, and story to function in unison. He also shows the limits of power. Though he built something no one had seen before, and though he defined what kingship would mean for centuries, even his system could not outlive neglect and entropy. Still, his name endures, etched not just in stone, but in the architecture of kingship itself. Echoes into the future. Djozer's model would echo far beyond Egypt. Future empires from Babylon to Rome to Byzantium would borrow this idea, that the king could be the center of cosmic order, that temples and cities could reflect divine hierarchy, and that architecture could enforce theology. In every ziggurat, basilica, or royal palace, we find some distant shadow of the step pyramid, a structure meant to outlast its builder, a claim in stone that power can be eternal. Final reflection. If Djoser gave divine kingship a foundation in stone, how would later rulers faced with new religions, new ideas, and new threats reinterpret or even reject that foundation? Story 3. The King's Body, Sacred Space and Rituals in Old Kingdom Temples. It is dawn in the heart of the Old Kingdom. In the temple complex of a mortuary cult near Giza, priests begin their daily routines. The temple awakens not with bells, but with silence, incense, and motion. At the center of it all lies not a statue, but the presence of the king, though he may have died decades ago. To the priests, and to the society that depends on these rituals, the king is still alive. His Ka is present. His breath lingers in the cold stone. This is not metaphor, this is theology. In this third story, we explore a different dimension of divine kingship, not through construction, conquest, or law, but through sacred space and daily ritual. If Djoser had reshaped the king's eternal image in stone, then his successors built temples that acted as the king's extended body, alive through ceremony, sustained by priesthood, and sacred by design. Here, kingship becomes ritualized space, and the temple becomes more than a structure, it becomes a mechanism to make eternity work. The king's body and the body of the temple. In ancient Egyptian thought, the king's body was not merely a human form, it was a cosmic vessel. His limbs, breath, and blood were seen as extensions of divine principles. Texts from the Pyramid Age even describe parts of the king as aspects of specific gods, his bones as Osiris, his eyes as Ra, his spine as the ladder to heaven. This physicality extended into architecture. Old Kingdom mortuary temples, particularly those from the 4th and 5th dynasties, were designed to embody the king. The layout was symbolic. Pylons, courts, sanctuaries, and chapels reflected not just ritual functions, but metaphysical anatomy. The entire complex became a body through which the king's divinity could move. The causeway between the valley temple and the mortuary temple, for example, often represented a passage between the earthly and the celestial. The inner sanctum, where offerings were made, was the king's heart both in location and in meaning. Thus, when priests performed rituals, they weren't simply honoring the king, they were activating his divine body. Ritual as survival, feeding the king's ka. Each day at dawn, the ritual cycle began. Priests entered the inner sanctum after undergoing purification rites. They washed, shaved, and dressed in white linen. Silence was observed. The air was thick with incense. The first task, opening the mouth. This ancient ritual, originally used at the king's burial, was reenacted daily in the temple. It was believed to allow the statue or the spirit of the king to receive offerings. Bread, beer, meat, onions, and milk were placed before the altar. Hymns were sung. Spells were recited. These were not symbolic acts. Egyptians believed the king's ka truly consumed these offerings not physically, but spiritually. Without them, his soul could weaken, causing imbalance in the cosmic order. So priests became caretakers not of memory, but of an ongoing metaphysical presence. They were not mourning the king, they were sustaining him. Priests as proxies, the king's ritual delegates. While the king was the only person authorized to speak directly to the gods, in practice, he could not perform every ritual in every temple across Egypt. So priests, especially in the Old Kingdom, acted in his name. This delegation was not merely administrative. It was sacred. Priests were trained in precise ritual movements, spells, and purification techniques. They recited prayers not on behalf of the king, but as the king. This identification was so complete that many priests were buried with inscriptions calling them one who performs the rituals of the king's house, or servant of the ka of king's name. To be a priest was to inhabit the king's body. Sacred geography, Giza and beyond. The most famous example of this model lies in Giza, where the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure were paired with elaborate mortuary temples and valley temples. These were not isolated tombs, they were ritual cities, connected by ceremonial causeways. Each king's mortuary complex was a machine of cultic continuity. The valley temple served as the place of embalming and purification, the causeway as a processional route, the mortuary temple as the site of daily offerings. These temples were aligned astronomically and topographically to reinforce cosmic order. The Giza pyramids align almost perfectly with cardinal directions, while the temples' layout often mirrored creation myths and solar movements. This careful placement was not aesthetic, it was ideological. The temples made heaven visible on earth, and the king stood at its center. The role of the sun and the solar cult. During the 5th dynasty, divine kingship became increasingly tied to the sun god Ra. Pharaohs such as Userkaf and Niuserre built sun temples at Abusir, north of Saqqara, in addition to their pyramids. These temples included open-air sanctuaries with obelisks or sun altars, emphasizing the visible presence of the sun, the living face of Ra. In this theology, the king was not merely the son of Ra, he was Ra's earthly manifestation. Daily rituals in the sun temples involved hymns to the rising sun, offerings at midday, and invocations at sunset. Priests carried sacred barks to represent the solar journey. In essence, the king's body was synchronized with the cycle of the sun. As Ra rose and set, so did the power and renewal of the king's divinity. The temple, then, became a clockwork for eternal kingship, measuring time through light and ritual. Statues and living presence. Central to temple ritual were statues of the king. These were not decorative, they were inhabited. Egyptians believed the ka of the deceased king could dwell in the statue during ritual, receiving offerings and radiating blessing. Statues were dressed in fine linen, perfumed and anointed. They were spoken to, not of. The language of ritual treated them as present, sentient beings. These statues were also carried in processions during festivals, where the king's image was brought out from the sanctuary to visit other temples or parts of the city. These processions were dramatic public affirmations of the king's continued life and power. In these acts, the boundary between image and reality dissolved. The king was dead, but he was also right there, in wood and stone, present and powerful. The daily liturgy, structure and repetition. Though the exact sequence varied over time and place, daily temple rituals followed a strict structure. Purification. Priests bathed and burned incense to purify themselves. Opening the doors, the sanctuary doors were unsealed, and the statue of the king or deity unveiled. Presentation of offerings. Food, drink, and goods were presented with incantations. Recitations. Hymns and prayers reaffirming the king's divinity were chanted. Feeding the Ka, the spirit of the king, was believed to consume the essence of the offerings. Sealing the shrine, the doors were closed, locking the sacred presence back in place. This cycle was repeated every single day, often multiple times a day, by teams of priests on a rotating schedule. Without these rituals, the divine king's presence might fade. The entire cosmos could become unbalanced. Thus, repetition was not tedious, it was existential. The temple as a political tool. Temples were not just sacred, they were centers of power. By controlling temple access, priestly appointments, and ritual calendars, the king ensured that his image and ideology dominated public life. Temples received royal funding and land grants, creating a network of loyalty across Egypt. Temple walls were also covered in reliefs depicting the king offering to the gods, especially scenes of smiting enemies, feeding gods, or receiving symbols of rule. These were public declarations of legitimacy and cosmic favor. In essence, temples were both spiritual engines and state propaganda. Continuity and risk. What if ritual fails? The entire system, ritual, sacred space, royal cult, depended on continuity. If offerings ceased, if priests abandoned their duties, the king's Ka could weaken. And if the king's presence faded, so might the balance of man across Egypt. This fear was not theoretical. In times of crisis, during droughts, invasions, or political collapse, temple rituals lapsed. Tombs were looted. Statues were broken. The system faltered. And when it did, people believed that chaos Isfet had returned. To prevent this, kings spent enormous resources securing their cults after death, endowing temples with land, appointing hereditary priesthoods, and building ritual calendars that spanned centuries. But no system is eternal. Even the best protected mortuary temples, like those at Giza and Saqqara, eventually fell silent. Unresolved question. If the king's body lived on through temple ritual, what happened when the priests forgot the words and the temple doors stayed shut? In the shadow of the pyramid temples, long after the king's physical body was sealed in stone and his name carved into offering tables, something curious unfolded. The priests who once whispered sacred formulas, cared for royal statues, and poured daily libations did not simply preserve the king's presence, they began to shape it. This second section of Story 3 explores the next evolution in divine kingship during the Old Kingdom, the institutionalization of the sacred. As royal mortuary temples flourished, priestly hierarchies expanded, temple economies grew, and the rituals meant to reinforce the king's divinity became both a spiritual obligation and a political structure. Through this lens, we see how rituals and sacred spaces, originally designed to glorify the king, could become the very forces that challenged or even diluted royal authority. The rise of the mortuary priesthood. As pyramid complexes grew in scale and complexity during the 4th and 5th dynasties, so too did the number of individuals required to maintain the sacred machinery. Each deceased pharaoh was assigned a full retinue of priests, known as servants of the Ka, who carried out daily offerings, performed liturgies, and oversaw the logistical work of maintaining temple grounds and goods. These roles were often prestigious, hereditary, and tied to powerful families. Many of these priests held the title Wab, Pure One, indicating their ritual cleanliness and spiritual authority. Others held administrative roles, such as overseer of priests, scribe of divine offerings, or guardian of the mortuary temple. The more successful a king's cult was meaning, the more land and goods it controlled, the more power these priests gained. And over time, their influence extended beyond the temple and into the broader administrative structure of the state. Temple land and the sacred economy. Egyptian temples during the Old Kingdom were not passive houses of worship. They were economic powerhouses. Kings endowed their mortuary temples with vast tracts of land, often from multiple provinces, which were worked by agricultural laborers, craftsmen, and herders. These lands were used to produce the offerings needed for daily rituals. Grain, cattle, wine, oil, and their surpluses generated immense wealth. Scribes maintained detailed records of temple inventories, output, and taxation. Some of these accounts survive on ostraca and papyrus, revealing just how complex temple economies had become. In this way, the ritual economy grew parallel to the state economy, and over time, the distinction between royal administration and religious administration began to blur. By the 6th dynasty, certain temples had more economic clout than some royal estates. Priestly families intermarried with the elite, built elaborate tombs of their own, and started to emulate royal rituals, writing prayers and commissioning statues that once only kings enjoyed. What began as service to the divine king evolved into a separate power structure, with its own interests and autonomy. The institutionalization of memory. Mortuary temples were not just religious spaces, they were memory engines. Each temple ensured the survival of the king's name, Ren, which was crucial in Egyptian theology. As long as the king's name was spoken and his rituals performed, his soul Ka continued to exist. To forget was to destroy. Therefore, temple rituals were not only theological acts, they were acts of preservation, keeping the king alive in both cosmic and cultural time. Priests became custodians of memory. They recited genealogies, maintained cult statues, and taught younger priests how to correctly pronounce spells. Inscriptions on temple walls emphasized this responsibility. But herein lay a subtle shift. The king no longer controlled his own memory, the priesthood did. Multiple kings, multiple cults. As more pyramids and mortuary temples were constructed, each requiring its own full-time priestly staff, Egypt found itself in a unique situation. Dozens of royal cults operating simultaneously. Old kings did not fade from the ritual calendar. They continued to receive offerings long after their successors ruled. Temples for kings like Sneferu, Khufu, and Menkora all functioned at the same time, each staffed and funded independently. This created redundancy, but also complexity. The more temples the state maintained, the more resources were diverted into keeping the dead alive. By the late Old Kingdom, some royal cults had become so independent that they functioned like semi-autonomous corporations, led by powerful priests with minimal interference from the reigning king. The 5th Dynasty's Solar Revolution. During the 5th Dynasty, kings began emphasizing their connection to the sun god Ra more explicitly than ever before. They constructed solar temples with open-air altars and obelisks, in which the sun's light played a central role in ritual. This was not just a religious innovation, it was a political strategy. By aligning themselves directly with Ra, kings like Userkaf and Neferurkher attempted to reclaim theological primacy from the growing power of priestly institutions tied to older deified kings. The solar cult centralized divine focus back onto the current monarch and his direct relationship with the creator god. It was, in effect, an attempt to reset the sacred hierarchy, the living king as the channel of divine favor, not merely a node among many. However, the very need for this realignment revealed the underlying challenge. Divine kingship was now being negotiated, not assumed. Architectural adaptations and religious symbolism. Temples evolved in form alongside ritual function. New innovations such as false doors, serdabs, sealed chambers for statues, and narrowing passageways were designed to shape the priest's movement and focus worship toward specific locations. These architectural features were more than symbolic. They conditioned ritual performance, channeling energy and presence toward the statue of the king or deity. In some temples, priests could not even see the statue directly. They placed offerings into small niches, spoke incantations into slits, or waved incense through grills. This emphasized the mystery and sanctity of divine presence, reinforcing the idea that the king or god was near, but never fully accessible. In this way, architecture was not passive, it was liturgical technology. The king's rituals without the king. By the late Old Kingdom, many priests serving in mortuary temples had never seen the king they worshipped. They were born long after his death. They performed rituals with inherited instructions, read names they barely understood, and kept alive cults whose relevance faded with time. Yet still they repeated the formulas, still they laid out the bread and beer, still they burned the incense. In doing so, they transformed kingship into a tradition, rather than a presence. The divine king had become a ceremonial memory, distant and mediated. What began as sacred immediacy, the king as living God, was now a set of procedures. Divine kingship was no longer spontaneous or charismatic. It had become bureaucratic. Sacred inertia and the cost of continuity. The strength of Old Kingdom religion was its resilience, but that resilience came at a cost. As more temples demanded resources, as more rituals required precision, and as more priesthoods inherited power, the economic burden of sacred maintenance grew. This sacred inertia maintaining rituals because they must be maintained began to drag on the state. Royal funds were spread thin. Land grants to temples reduced tax income. Administrative attention was pulled in competing directions. When combined with environmental challenges, political shifts, and weakened royal authority, the result was not immediate collapse, but gradual exhaustion. The system had become so rigid, so dependent on continuity, that it could not adapt quickly enough to crises. Unresolved question. If divine kingship was preserved through ritual and memory, what happens when the rituals lose meaning and memory fades? The sun has long since set over Saqqara. The temple walls, once alive with hymns, are silent. The statue of the king remains in its niche, untouched. No priests arrive to open the shrine doors. No offerings are made. No incense is lit. Dust settles on the floor where only gods once walked. This final section of Story 3 explores the slow unraveling of divine kingship in the temple complex, not through dramatic rebellion or fiery destruction, but through forgetting. As the Old Kingdom reached its twilight, the ritual systems that once sustained the king's divine presence weakened, not because people stopped believing, but because they stopped supporting. We explore what happens when the sacred becomes unsustainable, when temples become ghosts of memory, and when kingship loses its body in space. The ritual system at its peak. At the height of the 5th and early 6th dynasties, mortuary and sun temples covered the landscape of Lower Egypt. Each king, from Sahur to Teti, had his pyramid and accompanying temple, staffed by priests and supported by endowed land. This network was impressive, a liturgical system operating daily across generations, a statewide ritual economy aimed at one goal: keeping the divine king present forever. In some cases, these cults endured for centuries. Inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom refer to offerings still being made to Old Kingdom kings, but by then, the system was buckling under its own weight. More temples meant more priests meant more resources, and more complexity meant more vulnerability to disruption. Signs of erosion: the late Old Kingdom. By the reign of Pepi II, the last long-reigning king of the 6th dynasty, there are clear signs of decline. Mortuary temples begin to shrink in size and quality. Stone reliefs are less intricate. Inscriptions are repetitive, sometimes copied word for word from earlier reigns. Many scholars believe this reflects a loss of innovation, or perhaps a desperate effort to maintain tradition without the wealth or manpower to support it. Meanwhile, the power of Namark's regional governors grew. These elites began funding their own tombs, commissioning their own rituals, and sometimes claiming their own divine associations. The king, once the only conduit to the divine, now shared symbolic space with powerful officials. The central state, once embodied in stone and ritual, was thinning. The breakdown of the temple system. As royal authority weakened, temple rituals began to lapse. There are no dramatic records of priests rebelling or temples being burned. Instead, we see signs of quiet abandonment. Ritual calendars cease. Offering inventories are left incomplete. Temple walls are left unfinished. In places like Abusir and Saqqara, cultic installations fell into disrepair. Stones were taken from older temples to build new tombs. Priestly families, once wealthy and powerful, turned inward, focusing on their own survival. Worse still, grain shortages and irregular Nile floods destabilized the agricultural system. Without a strong central government to manage storage, transport, and redistribution, temple economies suffered. And when temples failed, so did the mechanisms that kept the king's soul alive. What was forgotten? The most profound loss was not material, it was ritual memory. Egyptian temple rituals were deeply tied to oral tradition and recitation. While written texts existed, the exact pronunciation of hymns, the precise gestures of invocation, and the intonation of sacred names were passed down through generations of priestly training. As priesthood scattered or died out, those oral traditions faded. The body of the king kept alive through daily ritual was now inert. In the pyramid texts, the king is often told, "Your name shall live for eternity." But eternity requires someone to speak the name. When no priest remains, when the offering ceases, the king dies a second death, the death of forgetting. Echoes in the First Intermediate Period. By the time Egypt entered the First Intermediate Period, c. 2180–2055 BCE, divine kingship was no longer centralized. Competing rulers in Heracleopolis and Thebes claimed kingship, but with none of the elaborate temple networks their Old Kingdom predecessors enjoyed. In this time of fragmentation, the idea of the king as the body of the state became almost impossible to maintain. Yet even in chaos, traces of the old rituals remained. Local officials referenced their service in now-defunct royal cults. Broken temple blocks were reused with reverence. The memory of divine kingship persisted, even as its institutional form crumbled. The afterlife of temples. Old Kingdom temples did not vanish. Many were later rediscovered, reused, or repurposed in the Middle and New Kingdoms. Priests reactivated cults, either to reclaim legitimacy or reconnect with perceived golden ages. Some temples were rebuilt, others were incorporated into new religious systems. The Abusir papyri, discovered in the Temple of Neferurkher, show detailed records of offering deliveries, priestly schedules, and inventories, fragments of a once thriving system trying to persist. But in each case, these revivals were not continuations. They were reconstructions, often based on incomplete knowledge, political necessity, or imagined memory. The original ritual life of these temples, so intimately tied to the king's body, could never be fully recovered. Sacred absence, when kings become statues. As centuries passed, the statues of long-dead kings remained, but they were no longer the focus of ritual. Instead, they became objects of curiosity, veneration, or even desecration. In some cases, statues were buried to protect them from invading armies or cultural shifts. In others, they were toppled or defaced acts of damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, that severed the king from his ritual body. But most commonly, they were simply left untouched, like sleeping gods waiting to be remembered. This silence was perhaps the most devastating outcome. Divine kingship had always required action, daily ritual, daily offerings, daily words. Without that motion, the king's divine presence faded. The body of the king, once encoded into temple walls, was now a ghost in stone. Legacy in dust and doctrine. And yet the model endured. When the Middle Kingdom arose, its kings revived many old kingdom ideals. They rebuilt temples, resurrected rituals, and emphasized the king's role as the restorer of man. But even they knew that something had changed. They no longer built pyramids like those of Khufu. They no longer believed that rituals alone could sustain eternity. Divine kingship had to be reinvented, adjusted for new political realities. Still they remembered, Djoser's name lived, the step pyramid stood, and the temple ritual, even in ruin, left its blueprint in every future palace and sanctuary. The stone that breathes no more. Today, visitors walk through the remains of old kingdom temples, barely aware of the voices once heard there. The king's presence, once believed to radiate from every wall, is now a subject of scholarly study, not sacred awe. But the influence is unmistakable. The idea that a ruler could be present through space, sustained by daily acts, represented in stone and statue, that idea lives on in medieval cathedrals, imperial mausoleums, and even modern architecture that claims permanence through design. It all began here with the king as the temple, and the temple as the king's body. Final reflection. If the king's presence could vanish with silence, how would later societies rebuild divine kingship in ways that no longer required daily ritual but still promised eternity? Story 4. False prophets and real power. The rise of the heretic king Akhenaten. The Theban temples are bustling. Incense drifts through the hypostyle halls of Karnak. High priests of Amun record their accounts, receive tribute, and prepare elaborate rituals in the name of a god whose power seems limitless. Amun has become the king of the gods. His cult rivals that of the pharaoh himself. And then something changes. A young king, known to history as Amenhotep IV, begins to appear at ceremonies not in the shadow of Amun's temple but beneath the open sky, arms raised not to statues but to the blazing sun. In his hymns, he praises Aten, a god not of form but of light. He soon ceases to speak of Amun at all. And by the time his reign reaches its 5th year, the transformation is complete. The temples of Amun are being shut down, their names scratched from walls. The capital itself is moved to a new, untainted land. The king changes his name to Akhenaten, he who is useful to the Aten. This is the beginning of one of the most radical and misunderstood experiments in divine kingship ever attempted. This section explores the origins of Akhenaten's revolution, the theological logic behind it, and the early cracks it revealed in Egypt's deeply rooted religious structure. A god among many, then a god alone. To understand Akhenaten's motives, we must first understand the religious landscape he inherited. By the end of the 18th dynasty's early phase, Amun-Re, the fusion of Amun and the sun god Ra, had become the undisputed leader of the Egyptian pantheon. His temple at Karnak in Thebes had grown into a spiritual empire, with priests, treasuries, landholdings, and political sway. Pharaohs were, by tradition, divine rulers but increasingly dependent on Amun's cult for legitimacy. The high priest of Amun was now almost equal to the king in wealth and ritual authority. This uneasy partnership was ripe for disruption. Amenhotep IV, the unlikely revolutionary. Amenhotep IV began his reign around 1353 BCE, following his father, Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's most powerful and luxurious monarchs. Amenhotep III had already begun shifting religious focus towards solar imagery, constructing open-air temples, emphasizing light, and referring to himself in increasingly divine terms. His son took this tendency much further. Rather than elevate himself within the existing pantheon, Amenhotep IV began to suppress it entirely. He stopped referring to Amun in temple inscriptions. He constructed temples to Aten, a previously minor solar deity, in Thebes and elsewhere. And most importantly, he changed the role of the king from one who served the gods to one who embodied the gods' will directly. Where once the king stood before divine images offering tribute, Amenhotep IV stood beneath the sun, offering prayers to its rays. This visual shift, so subtle, so strange, marked the end of an era. Aten, the god without a face. Unlike Amun, who had temples, statues, and an elaborate mythological persona, Aten was different. Aten was the solar disk, the visible sun. It had no image beyond the circle in the sky. Its power was expressed through rays ending in hands, often depicted in reliefs touching or blessing the king and his family. There was no mythology, no birth story, no animal form. Aten had no form of magic Heka, no complex theology. It was. This minimalism was radical. In a culture deeply tied to form, representation, and the ritual body of the gods, Aten was formless. It had no intermediaries, no priests except the king himself. This allowed Akhenaten to become the sole speaker for the divine. In his system, only he and his queen Nefertiti had access to Aten's blessings. The rest of Egypt could worship the royal couple, but not the god directly. Atenism was not just monotheism, it was monarchotheism. The new style, art and identity recast. Alongside his religious reforms, Akhenaten transformed royal art. Gone were the idealized, ageless forms of previous kings. In their place, Akhenaten was portrayed with an elongated face, wide hips, a protruding belly, and narrow shoulders. Nefertiti and their daughters were depicted alongside him in tender, even intimate family scenes, kissing, playing, basking under the rays of Aten. This style, now known as Amarna art, broke with millennia of Egyptian visual convention. It emphasized naturalism, informality, and emotional expression. But it also served a political purpose. It placed the royal family, not the pantheon, at the center of the religious world. Their bodies were the only access point to divinity. The king's image was now a liturgical object, a theological symbol of solar truth. To look at Akhenaten was to see the god in motion. Rejection of the priesthood. As Atenism rose, the priesthoods of other gods, especially Amun, faced direct attack. Akhenaten ordered the closure of temples, the defunding of priesthoods, and the erasure of divine names from inscriptions. Chisels scratched out Amun, Mut, and even plural gods from official records. The massive temple complex of Karnak fell into disuse. The priesthood, which had wielded real political and spiritual power, was silenced. This was not a reformation, it was a purge. Akhenaten may have sincerely believed that other gods were false, but politically, this was also a centralization of power. By eliminating the theological infrastructure of traditional religion, he removed the only institutional rival to kingship. He became the temple. His words, his hymns, his presence, these were the new rites. The city of the horizon, Akhetaten. In year 5 of his reign, Akhenaten did the unthinkable. He abandoned Thebes, the heart of Egyptian tradition, and ordered the construction of a new capital. The site he chose was a flat, empty stretch along the Nile's east bank, halfway between Memphis and Thebes. He named it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. The city was planned with unprecedented speed. Within a few years, it contained palaces, residential quarters, official buildings, and most importantly, open-air temples to Aten unroofed so the sun could shine directly upon offerings. Akhetaten was a city without gods except one. Its walls were carved not with traditional protective spells or prayers, but with hymns to light, praises of Aten, and images of the royal family. For the first time in Egyptian history, a capital was built not for the gods of the nation, but for one man's God. Hymn to the Aten, theology in verse. The great hymn to the Aten, found inscribed in tombs at Akhetaten, gives us the clearest sense of Akhenaten's theology. You rise in perfection on the eastern horizon of the sky. Living Aten, the beginning of life. When you rise on the horizon, you fill every land with your beauty. The hymn describes Aten as the creator of all life, the source of breath, the shaper of nations. It makes no reference to other gods. It emphasizes daily renewal, the majesty of light, and the uniqueness of the king's relationship to the divine. There is no underworld, no judgment, no Osiris, no cycle of death and rebirth, only light in its manifestation in the present. This is not just religious innovation, it is existential reorientation. Where traditional Egyptian religion focused on continuity, preservation, and resurrection, Atenism focused on daylight, on visibility, on the divine as immanent in the present moment. Public reception, uncertain faith. What did ordinary Egyptians make of all this? It's difficult to say. Most evidence from the period comes from official inscriptions, tombs of loyal officials, and Akhenaten's own city. There is little trace of popular resistance or support. It's possible that most people complied outwardly, continued personal devotions in secret, or simply adjusted their rituals to the new norms. Egyptian religion was deeply embedded in daily life. Changing its structure would have had profound psychological and social effects. But for those whose livelihood depended on the old temple's priests, artisans, scribes, caretakers, the shift must have been devastating. Whole communities lost purpose. Traditions once thought eternal were invalidated by decree. And yet, Akhenaten's system seemed to function at least for a while. A new order rising. As Akhetaten grew and Aten became the sole god of the state, Akhenaten stood at the center of an entirely new model of kingship. No longer the servant of the gods, he was now their replacement. He interpreted divine will directly. He shaped ritual. He composed hymns. He reimagined artistic representation. He reshaped time, space, and theology. And he did it alone. But even as the sun rose over his new capital, shadows began to gather. The empire weakened abroad. Communications with vassal states deteriorated. Old institutions, neglected and defunded, began to atrophy. Akhenaten had built a kingdom on light. But what happens when the sun sets? Unresolved question. If divine kingship depends on visibility and presence, how does it survive when the light goes out and the king dies? The sun still rose each day over the temples of Akhetaten. Offerings were still made in open-air sanctuaries. The king still walked the palace halls, his head bowed to Aten, dictating hymns of radiant light. But outside the city's carefully planned walls, the world was changing, and not in Akhenaten's favor. As the heretic king's reign advanced, the revolutionary clarity of Atenism began to dim. Foreign policy faltered. Egypt's traditional institutions atrophied. And behind the carefully maintained image of serene, solar devotion, a quiet instability was forming, a creeping fracture in the divine illusion. In this section, we trace the mid to late reign of Akhenaten, examining how the spiritual idealism of Atenism clashed with the political and administrative realities of Egypt's empire. We'll also explore how the very isolation that protected Akhenaten's religious experiment began to undermine his legitimacy, both in life and in memory. The Empire Unraveling, the Amarna Letters. Among the most revealing documents of Akhenaten's reign are the Amarna Letters, hundreds of clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the time, discovered in the archives of Akhetaten. These letters, written by vassal rulers in Canaan, Syria, and other regions under Egyptian influence, offer a glimpse of an empire in distress. Over and over, local rulers beg for help. Why does the king not send archers? My enemies surround me, will you not protect your servant? I am loyal, but others conspire. Without Egypt I am lost. And in many cases, no reply came. Akhenaten, so focused on religious transformation and internal ritual precision, appears to have neglected Egypt's foreign obligations. The empire's frontiers weakened. Local rulers fought among themselves. Egypt's once formidable international presence began to slip into silence. For a king who claimed to bring cosmic order, the world beyond Akhetaten was falling into chaos. Centralization to the point of collapse. In Akhenaten's religious model, only the king and his family could communicate directly with Aten. This created a radical centralization of religious authority, and with it, political authority as well. Priesthoods had been diminished or abolished. Old temples were closed or stripped. The traditional bureaucracy, once entwined with religious institutions, was hollowed out. Akhenaten governed not just as a ruler, but as a spiritual monopoly. But this system had one fatal flaw: it lacked redundancy. When power flows through a single person or a single family, everything depends on their availability, energy, and continuity. Should the king grow ill, distracted, or die without a strong successor, the entire structure collapses. Unlike previous dynasties, Akhenaten's Egypt had no robust administrative clergy or noble class to stabilize the system. It had the king, and only the king. The mystery of Nefertiti and the royal family. Early in his reign, Akhenaten's queen, Nefertiti, was nearly equal in prominence. She appeared beside him in religious rituals, received Aten's rays, and may have had some form of co-regency. But by around year 12 of the reign, she begins to vanish from inscriptions. Why? Theories abound. Some believe she died. Others suggest she changed her name and role, possibly becoming Smenkhkare, a short-lived co-ruler who emerges in the historical record just before Akhenaten's death. Still others think she was sidelined politically as the court fractured. Whatever the truth, her disappearance signals instability at the heart of the royal household, a troubling development for a regime whose theology depended entirely on the visibility and harmony of the royal family. Additionally, the couple's daughters, who had featured prominently in reliefs, also disappear from records one by one, possibly due to death or political realignment. By the later years of Akhenaten's reign, the divine household that had once radiated light now stood diminished and uncertain. The absence of the afterlife. One of the most unusual aspects of Atenism was its lack of a traditional afterlife. In earlier Egyptian religion, the dead passed through the underworld Juat, faced judgment by Osiris, and if worthy entered a blessed field of reeds. Temples, tombs, and daily rituals were structured around this cosmic journey. But under Akhenaten, these concepts were suppressed or abandoned. The underworld was never depicted. Osiris was ignored. Even tomb inscriptions lacked the usual protective spells and invocations. The focus was solely on life in the sunlight, on present devotion, not eternal preservation. This marked a profound shift. For the first time in Egyptian history, death was de-emphasized in theology. But this made Akhenaten's theology uniquely vulnerable. What happened after the king's death? If there was no afterlife, could the religion survive him? Would the light of Aten shine without its living intermediary? A city of light but no people. Akhenaten was built as a symbol of clarity and purity, a fresh horizon for a pure religion. But archaeological evidence suggests it was also thinly populated, with many areas unfinished or sparsely occupied. Large spaces, wide roads, and sprawling temple complexes dominate the city plan. But there is little evidence of bustling marketplaces, diverse neighborhoods, or the organic layering typical of Egyptian cities like Thebes or Memphis. The result was a capital that felt more like a ritual stage than a functioning metropolis. Life in Akhenaten revolved around appearance, the king's image, the alignment of temples, the daily rituals under the sun. But without deep roots in Egypt's religious traditions or administrative heartland, the city remained isolated, both physically and culturally. It was a capital of ideology, not of people. Resistance in silence. There is no direct evidence of rebellion or revolt during Akhenaten's lifetime. No inscriptions accuse him. No temples bear open signs of resistance. But silence is its own message. In tombs built during his reign, especially those of officials, there is a marked lack of traditional funerary language. The usual prayers to Osiris are missing. The scenes of judgment, the weighing of the heart, the guidance of Anubis all are gone. Instead, we see overly formulaic praise of Aten, repeated in near-identical inscriptions, often mechanically copied. This suggests a lack of deep conviction. The elite may have conformed to Atenism outwardly, but privately they may have mourned the loss of their traditions, keeping them alive only in memory or secret practice. By eliminating alternative rituals, Akhenaten created a spiritual vacuum, and one that would soon be filled by reaction. A king alone. In his final years, Akhenaten ruled a kingdom disconnected from its past and vulnerable to internal decay. He had alienated the priesthood, marginalized the traditional elite, and allowed Egypt's empire to weaken. His capital stood as a glowing beacon of belief but unsupported by broader systems. It could not last. The king's visibility, once his greatest strength, became his isolation. And when he died around year 17 of his reign, there was no clear plan for succession, no divine infrastructure to carry on the new faith. Atenism had shined brightly, but it had no roots. Unresolved question. If a divine king dies and leaves no temple, no priesthood, and no scripture, what remains of his godhood? The reign of Akhenaten ended not with a bang, but with a void. The pharaoh who once stood as the sole intermediary of Aten, radiant, absolute, and singular, died around his 17th regnal year, likely in Akhenaten, the very city he had raised from barren stone to sun-drenched sanctuary. But as the sun set on his life, so too began the swift and thorough dismantling of everything he had created. His successors, uncertain and short-lived, struggled to maintain his religious vision. Within less than 2 decades, his temples were abandoned, his god forgotten, and his memory declared anathema. Yet the shadows he cast lingered. In this final section, we explore what happened after Akhenaten's death, how Atenism collapsed, how Egypt reasserted its traditional religion, and how the experiment in divine kingship reshaped future pharaohs' relationship with power. It is a story of erasure, reversal, and the long echo of a sun once thought eternal. Smenkhkare and the mystery of succession. The immediate aftermath of Akhenaten's death is one of Egypt's murkiest historical periods. The name Smenkhkare appears suddenly in inscriptions, possibly as a co-regent or short-lived successor. Some scholars have proposed that Smenkhkare was a younger brother or son of Akhenaten, a separate individual who briefly took the throne, a disguised Nefertiti, ruling in male guise after Akhenaten's death. The evidence is too thin to say for certain, but what is clear is that the succession was not smooth, and the throne was no longer secure. In the vacuum left by Akhenaten's religious centralization, no institutions existed to guide the transition of power. Without priesthoods or divine oracles, there was no script for continuity. Atenism was personal, it lived and died with its creator. And so the state faltered. Enter Tutankhaten and then Tutankhamun. Around 1332 BCE, a boy of 9 ascended the throne. He was likely Akhenaten's son, possibly by a secondary wife named Kia. His birth name was Tutankhaten, living image of Aten. But just a few years into his reign, a significant change was declared. His name was officially changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amen. The symbolism was unmistakable. With that name change came a cascade of restoration. The temples of Amen, Mut, and Ta were reopened. Funding flowed back into traditional priesthoods. The capital was moved from Akhetaten back to Memphis. Public rituals, festivals, and statues once again praised the old gods. Decrees were issued denouncing the religious changes of the former king. It was not a peaceful evolution. It was a deliberate campaign of theological reversal. The heretic king's vision had failed. The great erasure, damnatio memoriae. What happened next was as brutal as it was systematic. Under the rule of Horemheb, a general who eventually took power after Tutankhamun's death, Akhenaten's name was stricken from every official record. His cartouches were chiseled out from monuments. His statues were smashed or buried. Temples to Aten were dismantled, their stones reused as filler in new buildings. Even the very city of Akhetaten was abandoned, its palaces left to decay, its sanctuaries crumbling under sand and time. This was damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. And it worked. For over 3,000 years, Akhenaten was all but forgotten. His name did not appear in king lists. His reign was excised from Egypt's official timeline. To his successors, he was not a misguided reformer. He was a heretic, a danger to the sacred balance of man. In this, we see perhaps the most devastating outcome of his divine kingship, a complete failure of legacy. Akhenaten's god, lost without a prophet. Aten, once the center of the known world, simply vanished. No further inscriptions invoked Aten by name after Tutankhamun's early reign. No temples were built. No cult statues, hymns, or festivals endured. Because Aten had no independent theology, no priesthood, and no mythic narrative, it could not survive its prophet. It was not a god of the people. It was a god of a single man. In this sense, Atenism revealed the limits of personal divinity in a state religion. Traditional Egyptian gods had depth, personality, plurality of interpretation. Aten had light and light alone. Without a system of succession or a class of priests to preserve the rituals, Aten returned to the sky as just a disk of fire. What was Akhenaten trying to achieve? Even today, scholars debate Akhenaten's motives. Was he a visionary monotheist, thousands of years ahead of his time? Was he a cynical politician, using religion to destroy the power of Amen's priesthood? Was he simply spiritually obsessed, consumed by a mystical devotion to solar light? The truth may lie in a combination of these. Akhenaten's language is often deeply sincere. His hymns show genuine awe for nature, light, and the creative power of the sun. He may have believed he was restoring a purer form of worship, free from the corruption of temple politics. But his methods, exclusionary, authoritarian, and aggressively anti-traditional, suggest a leader more dogmatic than enlightened. By placing himself as the only mouthpiece of the divine, Akhenaten built a system that could only function as long as he remained in power. The Amarna legacy, a warning in stone. Though Akhenaten was nearly erased, His story resurfaced in modern times thanks to archaeological discoveries in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially the excavation of Akhetaten, Tel el Amarna, and the deciphering of the Amarna letters. These finds shocked historians. A monotheistic experiment in polytheistic Egypt. A king who forbade gods and ruled as divine himself. A capital city built and abandoned within a generation. The Amarna period is now one of the most studied and most debated epochs in Egyptology. It represents a rupture in the long rhythm of ancient Egyptian tradition. It teaches us that divine kingship, when too tightly fused to a single person, becomes inherently unstable. Power must be shared, rituals must be adaptable, gods, even in authoritarian systems, must be bigger than their interpreters. Reflections from the horizon. In the end, Akhenaten's greatest flaw may have been his attempt to isolate divinity within the self. Rather than act as a bridge between gods and people, he cut the bridge off, leaving no way for his people to participate in the divine mystery except through him. This created a form of kingship more vulnerable than any before. It died with him, and yet his shadow remains, not in religious continuity, but in the question he posed. What happens when the king is not just a servant of God, but becomes the only God that matters? Final reflection, the light that fades. Akhenaten's Egypt reminds us that revolutions in belief may burn brightly, but they require infrastructure, plurality, and endurance to last. Power, when claimed exclusively, invites its own erasure. And even the sun, for all its daily rising, cannot be held in human hands. Story 5. The Priest-King Dilemma. Rule by robe and scepter in ancient Mesopotamia. The dusty plains of southern Mesopotamia, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates, harbor some of the earliest cities known to humanity. Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu rise from the riverbeds like sun-baked labyrinths of mudbrick and ziggurats. Their stories are older than stone pyramids, older than dynasties, older even than myths themselves. Here, in this primordial theater of civilization, divine kingship was not assumed, it was negotiated. In contrast to Egypt's central god-king model, Sumerian cities developed a different structure of sacred rule. Each city had its own patron deity, housed in a temple complex, attended by priests, and governed at times by kings who served as stewards or delegates of divine will. At the heart of this model was a delicate and enduring tension between temple and palace, between priest and king, between divine approval and earthly ambition. In this section, we explore how the early city-states of Mesopotamia experimented with divine legitimacy, how religious institutions amassed and exercised power, and how the kings who rose to prominence often found themselves beholden to the gods, but also to the men who spoke for them. Sumer, a mosaic of city-states. Around 3100 BCE, the southern Mesopotamian plain became a tapestry of independent city-states. Each had its own walls, patron deity, and ruling elite. But unlike the unified concept of divine kingship seen in Egypt, Sumerian rulers were not gods themselves, at least, not initially. Instead, they were servants of the gods. Their legitimacy derived from proximity to the divine, not embodiment of it. Each city's spiritual heart was the temple complex, the Eker or ziggurat, often the tallest and most elaborate structure, dominating the city skyline. These temples were not only sacred spaces but economic powerhouses. They owned land, employed laborers, collected taxes in grain and goods, and even maintained accounting systems using early cuneiform. The priests who ran them were literate, politically savvy, and deeply embedded in civic life. Before kings dominated politics, it was often these priestly bureaucracies that governed cities. En and Lugal, two paths to authority. The Sumerians had two distinct titles for leadership, En and Lugal. The En was a priestly leader, perhaps the original divine authority in the city-state. He was the high priest, the chief ritualist, and the intermediary with the god of the city. The En's role was spiritual leadership, though it came with considerable administrative power. The Lugal, literally big man, was a more secular, martial figure, a war leader or chief, who rose to prominence during times of conflict or political necessity. At first, these roles may have been separate, one presiding over ritual life, the other over defense and infrastructure. But as conflicts between city-states grew more common, Lugals began to consolidate power, taking over civic control and eventually assuming divine sanction. Thus began the slow fusion of priestly and royal functions, and the centuries-long tension between temple and throne. Lagash and the Great Temple Economy. The city-state of Lagash, one of the earliest and best documented in Sumer, offers insight into how temples wielded power. At its peak around 2400 BCE, Lagash's main temple, dedicated to the god Ningirsu, controlled vast estates, employed thousands of workers, and managed food distribution, textile production, and even international trade. Inscriptions on clay tablets show detailed inventories, lists of offerings, and complex bureaucratic oversight. The temple was, essentially, a proto-corporate state, a theocratic economy. Its priests held immense influence, and its leadership often came from within temple ranks. But as city rivalries intensified, new rulers emerged who challenged this religious hierarchy. One of these was Urukagina, a reformer king who sought to limit priestly power and curb corruption, an early attempt to wrest authority from the temples and reassert royal control. Urukagina and the first reformer king. Urukagina of Lagash, c. 2350 BCE, is often cited as the first lawgiver in recorded history. His inscriptions, carved on stone stele, outline a series of reforms aimed at reducing abuses of power, many of which were leveled at the temple elite. Among his reforms, prohibiting temple officials from seizing property arbitrarily, reducing excessive fees for rituals and burials, ending the forced labor of widows and orphans, limiting the lavish consumption of temple goods by priestly families. Urukagina framed these reforms as restoring justice, Nurum, a divine principle expected of kings. But his actions also reflect a power struggle. He sought to reduce the influence of the temples and elevate the authority of the palace. Unfortunately, his reign was short-lived. Lagash was soon conquered by Lugaltsagesi of Umma, who in turn was crushed by an even greater figure, Sargon of Akkad. Sargon of Akkad, the centralizing conqueror. With Sargon, c. 2334–2279 BCE, a new model of kingship emerged in Mesopotamia, one that fused divine authority with imperial power. Sargon claimed to rule by the love of Ishtar, the warrior goddess. Though not himself divine, he emphasized personal favor from the gods as the source of his legitimacy. His image, sword raised, became a symbol not of ritual stewardship but of conquest and unification. Under Sargon, temples were brought under central state control. Priests were appointed by the king, temple revenues were absorbed into imperial coffers, and the old city-state balance between En and Lugal was broken. This shift heralded a new era, the imperial priest-king not merely a servant of the gods, but a chosen enforcer of divine will on earth. Ziggurats and symbolism. Though kings like Sargon centralized power, they continued to build ziggurats, towering temple platforms that reached toward the heavens. These structures symbolized the connection between earth and sky, man and God. But ziggurats also served a political function. They reminded the populace that the king's power was granted by the gods, visibly reinforced in architecture, and embedded in public life. Just as pharaohs in Egypt built pyramids to assert eternal rule, Mesopotamian kings used ziggurats to anchor their authority in divine proximity. Even as temples came under state control, kings needed spiritual validation. They walked a tightrope, master of the gods' domains, but always presenting themselves as humble servant of heaven's will. Gods who could be deposed. One striking difference from Egypt was the mutability of divine favor in Sumer. Where Egyptian kings were seen as semi-divine and eternal in legitimacy, Sumerian rulers understood that gods could change their minds. A temple sacked, a city flooded, a field barren, these were seen as signs that the gods had turned away. As a result, divine kingship in Mesopotamia was fragile. Kings constantly needed to reaffirm their legitimacy through temple building, offerings, and public rituals. They issued prayers, hymns, and treaties emphasizing their piety and devotion. Divinity was never assured. It was earned and revocable. This bred a culture of performative humility, even among powerful monarchs. An open question: who really ruled, the priest or the king? Throughout the history of Sumer and Akkad, a question remained unresolved. Who was the true conduit of divine will? Was it the En, who communed with the gods in secret ritual, interpreting dreams and signs? Or the Lugal, who marched with armies, administered laws, and claimed divine favor through conquest? Sometimes they were one and the same. Other times they were rivals in the same city. Often, kings attempted to subsume the priesthood into the royal household, appointing sons as high priests, building new temples, or co-opting rituals. Yet the question lingered, and it would reappear in future empires, in Babylon, in Assyria, even in medieval Europe. Unresolved thought. If the divine will must be interpreted by human hands, how do we know which hands are true and which are merely seizing godhood in the name of power? As the dust settled from the collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE, the southern cities of Mesopotamia attempted to rebuild a more stable order, one that could reconcile the divine role of the king with the persistent authority of the priesthood. The Sumerian city-states briefly regained autonomy, but they could not fully restore the delicate Lugal balance of old. Temples remained important, but the future belonged increasingly to kings who could write themselves into cosmic law. One city in particular would succeed in crafting a model that outlasted many of its contemporaries: Babylon. From the early rulers of the first Babylonian dynasty to the legal innovations of Hammurabi, Babylon crafted a new form of kingship that merged religious legitimacy with political administration. Here, the king was no longer just a servant of the gods, nor a god himself, but the instrument of divine justice, a sacred lawgiver, elevated not through conquest alone but through order. In this section, we examine the Babylonian kings' evolving relationship with divine authority, the law codes that became their legacy, and how Babylonian rulers positioned themselves as judges on behalf of the gods, rather than gods in flesh. The rise of Babylon. Babylon began as a relatively minor city in the early 2nd millennium BCE, but under King Hammurabi, r. 1792–1750 BCE, it became the dominant force in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi inherited a small territory and expanded it through diplomacy, warfare, and political maneuvering, eventually uniting much of southern Mesopotamia under his rule. What set Hammurabi apart, however, was not only his military prowess but his cultural vision. He did not just conquer, he codified. And in doing so, he offered a new solution to the priest-king dilemma. The Stele of Hammurabi, law as divine mediation. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the most iconic documents in history. Carved onto a basalt stele over 7 feet tall, it contains 282 laws, written in Akkadian cuneiform. These laws address everything from property rights and marriage to theft, debt, and criminal punishment. But the legal content, while important, is not the most revealing part. At the top of the stele is a relief carving of Hammurabi standing before the sun god Shamash, god of justice. Shamash, seated on a throne, hands Hammurabi a rod and a ring, symbols of divine authority and measurement. This image matters. It shows that Hammurabi does not claim to be a god. Instead, he positions himself as chosen by the god of justice to bring divine order to the people. He becomes the interpreter of cosmic law, not the originator. In this way, Hammurabi aligns both priestly and royal power behind a third pillar, written law. Law as a theological tool. Hammurabi's code did more than govern. It reshaped how kings were understood. Kingship was no longer strictly martial or hereditary. It was judicial and divine. The king became the guardian of equity, charged with upholding balance, Kiddu, and truth, Mesharu. The laws were displayed publicly, suggesting transparency and a shared moral order. Of course, these ideals often mask the reality of hierarchical enforcement. The code favored elites, enforced strict social stratification, and included brutal punishments, the infamous eye for an eye principle. But the symbolic power of the king, as a divinely sanctioned lawgiver, took root. Future rulers across Mesopotamia would emulate this model, not only issuing laws, but framing themselves as arbiters of divine will through justice. Temples under royal oversight. Even as kings like Hammurabi centralized power, temples remained important, but their autonomy was steadily eroded. Kings now appointed high priests. Temple land and revenue were subject to royal audit. The scribes who worked in temples increasingly answered to the palace bureaucracy. This wasn't a suppression of religion, it was a realignment. The king became the protector of the gods' houses, building and restoring temples in return for divine favor. Royal inscriptions often list temple construction as a key accomplishment, proof that the king was in harmony with the divine. Yet even in this alignment, tensions simmered. When kings fell out of favor, Mesopotamian theology remained transactional. The gods provided blessings in return for correct behavior. If cities were sacked, if floods came, if famine struck, people assumed the king had displeased the gods. This created a paradox. The king was supposed to be the divine justice bringer, but his own legitimacy could be revoked by divine signs. This dynamic played out most dramatically in the story of Nabonidus, the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nabonidus and the return of the priests. Ruling from 556 to 539 BCE, Nabonidus was an unconventional king. He neglected the temples of Marduk, Babylon's chief god. He elevated the moon god Sin, even building a massive temple to Sin in Haran. He left Babylon for a decade, ruling from distant Arabia while entrusting power to his son Belshazzar. The priesthood of Marduk, deeply embedded in Babylonian identity, turned against him. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he did so peacefully, welcomed by the priests. Cyrus presented himself as a restorer of traditional religious order, honoring Marduk and other Babylonian deities. This episode underscores how kings could not ignore the priesthood entirely. Divine legitimacy required constant reaffirmation and alignment with traditional worship. When that link was broken, the throne could crumble. Sacred space and power. Throughout Babylonian history, temples remained power centers not just spiritually but economically. They held land, collected tithes, and sometimes even minted silver. The king, as much as he sought to rule over them, also depended on them. For rituals legitimizing his reign. For scribes who recorded his decrees. For festivals like the Akiddu, the New Year ceremony, during which the king's fate was ritually reaffirmed. During the Akiddu festival, the king was stripped of his regalia, slapped by the high priest, and made to confess his unworthiness. Only after receiving the god's blessing could he resume his rule. It was a moment of ritual vulnerability, one that reminded all watching that kingship was conditional. The long legacy of the lawgiver king. The Babylonian model of divine kingship, legalistic, priest-mediated and ritualized, would echo through centuries. The Assyrians would use it to justify brutal expansion, framing conquest as divinely mandated order. Persian kings, like Darius and Xerxes, would claim to rule by the grace of Ahura Mazda, but continued to govern through inherited Babylonian bureaucracy. Even Alexander the Great, after conquering Babylon, adopted local rituals to gain the support of the temple elite. In all these cases, divine legitimacy came not from claiming divinity, but from mastering the tools of divine administration: temples, law, and ritual. Closing thought: rule by consent or ritual. Babylonian kings walked a fine line. They were not gods, but they ruled by divine selection. They were not priests, but they presided over sacred rites. They were not above the law, but they created it. In this system, power was not absolute, but performed through tablets, ceremonies, and supplication. And so we ask, if a king must bow before a priest each year to keep his throne, who truly holds the scepter? By the first millennium BCE, the Mesopotamian landscape had changed. The Sumerian city-states had long since faded. The grandeur of Babylon had risen and receded in cycles. But in the north, another power had grown, not slowly or softly, but with calculated violence and ideological clarity. This was Assyria. The Assyrians did not merely rule, they dominated. Their kings didn't just govern, they commanded. From their capitals at Ashur, Nineveh, and Nimrud, they forged an empire built not only on conquest, but on a fusion of religious orthodoxy and absolute military power. Here, the priest-king dilemma reached a terrifying resolution. In Assyria, the king was no longer simply chosen by the gods, he acted as the weapon of the gods. His wars were holy. His laws were divine pronouncements. His triumphs, etched in stone and sung in hymns, were described not as political victories but as expressions of divine wrath. In this final section, we examine how Assyrian rulers developed a brutal and transcendent form of divine kingship, how they merged temple and throne, and how their fall reminds us that the more absolute a king's divinity becomes, the more fragile his kingdom may grow. Ashur, God and state in one name. The city of Ashur gave its name to the god Ashur, and the people who worshipped him, the Assyrians. Unlike the complex pantheon of Babylon, where Marduk ruled among many, Ashur was a singular national god. His will was indivisible from the fate of the state. To serve Ashur was to expand Assyria's borders. War was worship. This is the defining principle of Assyrian kingship. The king was Ashur's general on earth, expected to expand his dominion and punish the enemies of the divine order. Temples and palaces shared architectural elements. Court rituals mirrored religious rites. And most significantly, the king's identity fused with Ashur's authority. This was not priestly mediation, it was holy autocracy. Assyrian royal inscriptions, divine justification in stone. The kings of Assyria left behind thousands of inscriptions carved into walls, stelae, and palace reliefs. These texts follow a formula, a declaration of divine appointment, a list of military campaigns, and a statement of cosmic order restored. Take, for example, Ashurnasirpal II, R 883-859 BCE, who boasted, "Ashur and the great gods, my lords, have called me to rule, and I am their chosen one. I cut down their enemies like reeds, I built great cities in their name, I raised temples to please them." Or Tiglath-Pileser III, R 745-727 BCE, who claimed, "By the command of Ashur, I crushed all who opposed me. I extended the boundaries of the world." These were not modest invocations of divine favor. They were bold fusions of theology and kingship, making the Assyrian ruler both servant and sword of the gods. The king as chief priest of Ashur. In addition to being a warrior and administrator, the Assyrian king also served as high priest of the state religion. During major festivals, particularly the New Year Akitu festival, he would perform sacrifices, lead processions, and recite sacred hymns. Unlike Babylon, where the high priest might slap the king to humble him, Assyria offered no such humiliation. The king stood at the pinnacle of both sacred and secular hierarchy. His body itself became a vessel of sanctity, court rituals included. Anointing with oils blessed by temple priests. Wearing sacred garments symbolizing divine roles. Maintaining strict purity laws before entering temples. The king's every public action battle decree, construction was framed as obedience to Ashur. The brutality of divine mandate. With divinity came license. Assyrian kings did not hide their violence, they celebrated it. Reliefs from the palaces of Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal depict graphic scenes. Impaled enemies lining city walls. Heads stacked in piles before royal thrones. Captives skinned alive and displayed as warnings. These weren't acts of sadism for their own sake. They were part of ritualized terror, designed to demonstrate the cost of defying divine order. In this sense, the Assyrian king was more than human, but also more than priest. He was a weaponized God's servant, fusing the violence of war with the absolution of religion. Architecture and omnipresence. Assyrian kings built palaces to overwhelm and intimidate. The palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh, for example, stretched over 100 hectares and included more than 80 rooms of sculpted stone panels, a system of canals and gardens mimicking paradise, massive guardian figures, Lamashu, at every gate, human-headed bulls with wings, symbols of divine watchfulness. Every architectural feature reinforced the eternal authority of the king. Reliefs portrayed him hunting lions, a metaphor for conquering chaos, presiding over tribute from distant lands, and standing face to face with the gods. There was no ambiguity. The king was divinely visible, and his enemies were cosmically doomed. Ashurbanipal, the scholar king and the end of an empire. Among the last great Assyrian kings was Ashurbanipal, r. 669–631 BCE, a paradox of sorts. He was a ruthless general, known for crushing rebellions in Elam and Babylon with typical Assyrian ferocity. Yet he was also a patron of knowledge, overseeing the construction of the Library of Nineveh, a collection of over 30,000 tablets. Ashurbanipal collected texts on omens, rituals, medicine, and law. He boasted of being able to read the intricate signs of the sky and to understand the obscure words of Sumer and Akkad. In him, the roles of priest and king, scholar and warrior merged completely. Yet his death marked the beginning of the end. A series of civil wars, external invasions, and economic strain led to the collapse of Assyria by 609 BCE. Fall of the divine tyrant. The fall of Nineveh came not with a slow decline, but with a sudden and violent end. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes razed the city, burned its palaces, and left its temples in ruin. Contemporary records speak of devastation so complete that later generations thought Nineveh a myth. What brought about this collapse? The empire had grown too large to manage. Its kings relied on fear, not love, to rule. And perhaps most significantly, their claims of divine invincibility left no room for failure. Once defeat came, the illusion shattered. If the king was truly chosen by the gods, then how could he fall? If Ashur was all-powerful, why had he abandoned his city? The answer could not be explained within Assyria's own theology, and so the entire structure crumbled: temple, throne, and ideology together. Reflections: the price of fusion. In Assyria, the priest-king dilemma was not negotiated, it was crushed. The king absorbed the priesthood, merged with the divine, and left no space for competing voices. And yet, in doing so, he became fragile. When a king stands above all, his failure becomes a theological crisis. In Sumer, kings were toppled, but the priesthood endured. In Babylon, kings were deposed, but the temples adapted. In Assyria, the entire system depended on the king's godlike success. And when that success failed, there was nothing left to fall back on. Final thought: must the divine be shared? The long journey from Sumer to Assyria reveals a spectrum of divine kingship. From ritual partners, the En and the Lugal, to lawgivers and stewards, Hammurabi and Nabonidus, to theocratic conquerors, Ashurnasirpal and Sennacherib. Each system tried to reconcile power with holiness, human ambition with divine will. But Assyria's model, though terrifyingly effective, collapsed under its own absoluteness. So we are left with a question as old as kingship itself. Can any man carry the full weight of heaven alone? Story 6. The Crowned Republic: How the Roman Senate Made and Unmade Emperors. The Roman Republic was a marvel of political engineering, a system that blended aristocratic control with popular participation, built to withstand the ambitions of any single man. It endured for centuries, flexing, adapting, and expanding until the seams stretched too far. The transformation from republic to empire did not happen overnight, and contrary to later propaganda, it was not the work of one man. Instead, it was a gradual, grinding process. It began not in blood and glory, but in committee meetings, legal loopholes, and emergency powers. What made the Roman system remarkable was not how violently it fell, but how quietly it adapted to tyranny under the guise of saving the state. In this story, we explore how Roman leaders transitioned from elected magistrates to near-divine emperors, and how, for all its trappings of republicanism, the Senate, the proud body of Rome's patricians, played a willing role in the creation of monarchy. It is a story of reluctant dictators, ambitious generals, and a political machine that kept ticking even as it hollowed itself out. The cursus honorum and the limits of power. In the classical republic, Roman politicians followed a formal career ladder known as the cursus honorum. Quaestor, aedile, praetor, consul. Each office had strict age limits, term limits, and collegiality, meaning no one ever held sole power. Even consuls, the highest magistrates, ruled in pairs and only for 1 year. This structure was designed to distribute authority and prevent monarchy from re-emerging. The memory of Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome, remained a political warning. But as Rome expanded, this system came under pressure. Wars lasted longer than 1-year terms. Provinces required governors with extended powers. Commanders needed continuity to maintain legions and loyalty. Enter the dictator, an emergency office granted total power for 6 months. It was meant to be rare, but soon it became the tool by which men like Sulla and Caesar redefined the Roman state. Sulla's precedent: terror in the name of order. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a general and aristocrat, became dictator in 82 BCE after marching his army on Rome twice. What followed was not just civil war, but institutionalized violence. Sulla published proscription, lists names of enemies marked for death, and property confiscation. Thousands were killed, not by trial but by declaration. The Senate expanded under his control, filled with loyalists. Yet when he was finished, Sulla resigned the dictatorship and retired to private life. His reforms, ironically, sought to restore the republic, but only after passing through tyranny. His legacy was clear. A strong man could seize power with the Senate's blessing, provided he called it temporary. The precedent had been set. The rise of Caesar, populist or monarchist. Gaius Julius Caesar, mastered the art of bending republican forms to personal will. He rose through the cursus honorum like others, but gained lasting power through military conquest in Gaul, generous land grants to soldiers and the poor, strategic marriages and debt forgiveness to win elite and popular support. In 49 BCE, when ordered to disband his army, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, declaring war on the Senate itself. After defeating Pompey and securing his position, Caesar accepted extraordinary titles: Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life; Pontifex Maxima, chief priest; Imperator, military commander. Statues were erected. A golden throne was placed in the Senate. The month of Quintilis was renamed July in his honor. Though he never called himself king, the symbolism was obvious. This was monarchy by another name. The Ides of March, death for a republic already dying. On March 15, 44 BCE, Caesar was stabbed to death by a group of senators calling themselves the Liberators. Their motive, to save the republic from tyranny. But it was already too late. The systems that once constrained ambition had been bypassed. The Senate had delegated emergency powers rather than resist. Governors acted like kings in distant provinces. Soldiers pledged loyalty to generals, not the state. The republic had become a shell, a framework, used to justify personal power. The assassins hoped to restore liberty, but their actions plunged Rome into renewed civil war. From republic to ritual. After Caesar's death, his adopted heir Octavian, later known as Augustus, learned from the mistakes of his predecessor. He never claimed the title of king. Instead, he accumulated honors gradually. Princeps, first citizen; Imperium Maius, supreme command; tribunician power, veto authority. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, but all real authority flowed from Augustus. He even declared the restoration of the Republic in 27 BCE, framing his rule as a return to tradition. It was a brilliant lie, and the Senate, eager for stability, not only accepted it, they enshrined it. The imperial cult begins. Soon after Augustus's death in 14 CE, the Senate deified him, a practice that would become standard for emperors. Temples were built in his name. Priesthoods were dedicated to his cult. Emperors became gods in death and increasingly divine in life. The transition was complete. A system designed to prevent monarchy had birthed a divine monarchy, where the Senate's primary role was to applaud. Closing thought: the disappearance of resistance. Rome did not fall into empire with a scream, but with a series of quiet compromises. The Senate, once the greatest deliberative body in the ancient world, became a stage for ritual affirmations, its members more eager to survive than to speak. So we ask, when power wears the mask of legality, how do you know when the Republic has ended? The death of Augustus marked the end of the Republic in all but name, but it also marked the beginning of something new, an era in which Rome's emperors, still called princeps, still cloaked in republican vocabulary, held absolute power, but pretended not to. This section explores the second phase of Roman divine kingship, the Principate, a system that relied on careful performance. The emperor wielded supreme authority while maintaining the appearance of deference to tradition. The Senate remained, but as an audience more than an institution. And for a time, this arrangement worked. From Tiberius to Marcus Aurelius, emperors kept up the fiction of the crowned republic, balancing between autocracy and ancestral reverence. They maintained the illusion that the Senate still mattered, and the Senate played along, offering divine honors, official titles, and declarations of eternal loyalty. But cracks would appear, sometimes subtly in private letters and graffiti, sometimes violently in assassinations and civil wars. Because the truth remained, a system that pretends to be free is fragile, especially when those in power begin to believe their own illusions. Tiberius and the reluctant tyrant. When Tiberius, the stepson of Augustus, took power in 14 CE, he did so reluctantly, at least on the surface. He deferred to the Senate, emphasized legal process, and resisted overt ceremony. He maintained the facade that the emperor was merely first among equals. But this modesty masked a growing paranoia. Tiberius withdrew from public life, moved to the island of Capri, and ruled through intermediaries, most notoriously Sejanus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Trials for treason increased. Informants flourished. The Senate, cowed into submission, passed decree after decree in his name. Tiberius never claimed divinity in life, but upon his death, the Senate debated whether he should be deified or condemned. They chose divinity less out of conviction than convention. It was the beginning of a pattern: emperors judged by committees, gods by vote. Caligula, the god that walked. If Tiberius was cautious, Caligula, 3741 CE, was the opposite. Early in his reign, he was hailed as a breath of fresh air. He restored popular games, pardoned prisoners, and distributed bonuses to soldiers. But soon, signs of divine delusion emerged. He began to appear in public dressed as Jupiter or Apollo. He insisted that a statue of himself be placed in the Temple of Jerusalem. He conversed with the moon, claimed to be a living god, and declared war on Neptune. At one point, Caligula reportedly made his horse, Incitatus, a priest, and may have planned to make him a consul. The Senate stood by, silent or sycophantic. Eventually, his guards murdered him. The Senate considered restoring the Republic briefly. But the Praetorian Guard had other plans. Claudius, the scholar emperor chosen by soldiers. Claudius, 4154 CE, Caligula's uncle, was found cowering behind a curtain in the palace after the assassination. The Praetorians dragged him out, hailed him as emperor, and the Senate, left with no alternative, ratified the decision. He was physically awkward, often mocked, and politically inexperienced, yet he proved effective. Expanded Roman territory into Britain. Reformed the judicial system. Increased the bureaucracy by elevating freedmen into key roles. Claudius emphasized tradition. He sat in the Senate, participated in debates, and maintained the rights of the Republic. But the balance was shifting. The military now made emperors, and the Senate merely approved. Nero, the artist on the throne. Nero, 5468 CE, the last of the Julio-Claudian line, is remembered for fire, excess, and cruelty, but he began as a popular ruler. Tutored by the philosopher Seneca, he embraced public games, reduced taxes, and performed for the people. He also performed literally on stage. Nero fancied himself a musician and actor, often appearing in Greek-style contests, singing and playing the lyre. Senators were required to attend. His vanity grew intolerable. He executed his own mother, Agrippina, and stepbrother. Blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Drained the treasury to fund artistic projects. Eventually declared a public enemy by the Senate, Nero fled and committed suicide. His last words, "What an artist dies in me." But the real tragedy was institutional. By this point it was clear, emperor was now a stage role and the Senate the audience. The year of the four emperors, chaos and choice. After Nero's death, Rome plunged into civil war. In just 1 year, 69 CE, 4 emperors rose and fell. Galba chosen by the Senate, overthrown by the Guard. Otho ruled briefly, then committed suicide. Vitellius, backed by the German legions, killed by rivals. Vespasian, general from Judea, ultimately victorious. Each claimed legitimacy. Each relied on a different institution: Senate, army, or people. The chaos made one thing clear: Legitimacy no longer came from Roman law, but from violence and recognition. In this environment, the Senate became reactive. Its power lay not in choosing, but in ratifying what had already been decided elsewhere. The adoptive emperors, a temporary restoration of stability. The Flavian and Nerva-Antonine dynasties, 69–180 CE, marked a period of relative calm. Emperors like Trajan, 98–117, expanded Rome to its greatest territorial extent. Hadrian, 117–138, consolidated borders, built Hadrian's Wall. Marcus Aurelius, 161–180, philosopher king, authored Meditations. These men were not chosen by blood, but adopted for competence, a tradition that helped prevent dynastic instability. They honored the Senate, consulted it regularly, and participated in its ceremonies. Yet even they wielded unchecked power, and the Senate had no real recourse when things went wrong. Marcus Aurelius's decision to break with tradition and appoint his biological son Commodus, 180–192, marked the beginning of decline. Commodus, the collapse of pretend. Commodus viewed the Senate with open contempt. He dressed as Hercules, fought in gladiatorial games, and demanded deification while alive. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana. He declared all months of the year after himself. And still, the Senate did nothing until he was strangled in a plot led by his mistress and palace officials. Commodus's reign marked the end of the Principate's delicate balance. From this point on, emperors ruled more openly as autocrats, with less need for pretense. The fiction crumbles. By the 3rd century CE, Rome's imperial system had abandoned the mask. Emperors rose from the army, not aristocracy. The Senate became largely ceremonial. Coins, monuments, and titles declared the emperor's divinity outright. The idea of Rome as a republic in name had outlived its usefulness. Even the Emperor Diocletian, R. 284–305, would formally style himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, marking a definitive break from Augustus's modest title of first citizen. Unfinished thought: was the Senate to blame? Throughout these centuries, one question lingered in every marble hall. Was the Senate merely a victim of imperial overreach or its enabler? They passed the laws, they conferred the titles, they stood and applauded when emperors declared themselves divine. In this silence, in this applause, the republic faded not with rebellion but with consent. By the end of the 3rd century CE, the Roman imperial system no longer resembled the balanced republic of Cicero or the careful facade of Augustus. What remained was a hardened, vertical state in which the emperor no longer bothered to pretend he was just a citizen with special duties. He was now the state incarnate. The transition from principate to dominate, from first citizen to Lord and God, didn't happen overnight. It emerged from crisis, plagues, border invasions, economic collapse, and ceaseless civil war. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had over 20 emperors, most dying violent deaths. Into this chaos stepped Diocletian. In this final section of Story 6, we examine how Diocletian and Constantine restructured the imperial system into something overtly divine, bureaucratic, and sacred, how monarchy, once Rome's nightmare, became its salvation, and how the Senate, now relegated to ceremony and pageantry, continued to bow to crowns it once swore to resist. Diocletian, order through divinity. When Diocletian seized power in 284 CE, the empire was fractured, provinces were in revolt, the military was unruly, currency was devalued. To stabilize the system, Diocletian introduced profound reforms. 1. The Tetrarchy. He divided the empire into East and West, each ruled by an Augustus, senior emperor, and a Caesar, junior emperor. The goal was orderly succession and regional governance. 2. Administrative expansion. Diocletian doubled the number of provinces, creating more governors and smaller jurisdictions. He separated civil and military powers, undermining local generals who could challenge central rule. 3. Economic control. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, an early attempt at wage and price controls. Coinage was reformed, and taxation was standardized by land and population. But perhaps the most striking change was how he positioned himself. He wore elaborate robes and a jeweled diadem, abandoning the simple toga. Audiences with the emperor required proskenses, a full-body bow, borrowed from Persian court ritual. He adopted the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. It was a shift not just in power but in presence. The emperor was now remote, sacral, and elevated. Gone was the princeps. In his place stood a living icon of the divine. The disappearance of the Senate. By Diocletian's reign, the Senate still existed in Rome, but its role was symbolic. It no longer appointed governors. It no longer voted on laws. It did not name emperors. Its members still held titles, wore robes, and met in the curia, but their debates had no legislative power. They confirmed what was already decided by the emperor. In Constantinople, a new Senate would later be established under Constantine again, a council in name, not power. The emperor no longer needed aristocratic consensus. He had God's favor, the army's loyalty, and a bureaucracy that extended to the farthest provinces. The emperor as religious figure. While Diocletian was a staunch pagan who persecuted Christians, his reforms laid the groundwork for an imperial theology that would soon merge with monotheism. The emperor's authority was eternal, passed through sacred succession; total, executive, judicial, military; universal, over all subjects regardless of status; divinely sanctioned, rooted in cosmic order. This vision prepared the way for the next great transition: Christian empire. Constantine and the imperial church. In 312 CE, Constantine the Great defeated his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, claiming he had done so under a divine sign, the Chi-Rho, the first letters of Christ's name. He quickly moved to consolidate his image as God's chosen ruler. In 313, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity. He patronized churches, clergy, and Christian bishops. He convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to resolve theological disputes, becoming the first emperor to direct a Christian synod. Constantine did not make Christianity the empire's official religion that would come later, but he embedded it into imperial authority. He built a new capital, Constantinople, a Christian city with Roman bones. He placed the imperial palace next to the Church of the Holy Apostles, a symbolic fusion of throne and altar. In his coins, his statues, and his rituals, Constantine presented himself not just as an emperor who believed in Christ, but as Christ's regent on earth. The new divine kingship. With Constantine, the Roman emperor became something new and old at once. He retained the sacred kingship seen in Eastern monarchies. He preserved the centralized military control of the pagan emperors. But he now spoke the language of Christian providence, victory by the grace of God. His successors would build on this template. Theodosius I, R. 379-395, made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Pagan temples were closed. Heresies were treated as political crimes. The emperor was no longer merely a servant of the gods, he was the guardian of Christian orthodoxy. The Roman state had become a Christian monarchy, one whose theological legitimacy no longer required a senate at all. The final rituals of the Senate. Despite its obsolescence, the Roman Senate lingered as a theater of nostalgia. It still held sessions. Senators still wore purple-trimmed togas. They debated minor municipal issues. They welcomed emperors with speeches. They minted honorary inscriptions. But they did not rule. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell in 476 CE, the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a barbarian general, Odoacer. No Senate convened to object. The Senate itself faded shortly after, likely dissolved or simply abandoned in the decades that followed. Its final acts were ceremonial, approving statutes, celebrating anniversaries, and clinging to titles that no longer meant anything. In Constantinople, the Eastern Senate would endure in some form into the 7th century, but always as an audience, never an author of law. Reflections: the crown the Republic could not refuse. The Roman Republic was not destroyed by barbarian swords or foreign religions. It was undone by its own elite, who chose survival over principle, convenience over resistance. The Senate, designed to check ambition, became a ladder to imperial praise. It named gods. It granted crowns. It clapped as emperors turned temples into churches and tribunals into courts of the divine. The divine kingship of Rome was not imposed by brute force alone. It was performed, sanctified, and accepted. And once accepted, it proved enduring. The idea of the emperor as divinely guided, ritually distinct, and cosmically essential would carry into the Byzantine emperors, the Holy Roman emperors, medieval kingship in Christian Europe. Even today, remnants linger in coronation rites, imperial titles, and the language of modern states that claim divine or sacred missions. Closing reflection: the crowned republic. In the end, the Roman Republic became a monarchy not through conquest but ritual. And the Senate, once the guardian of liberty, became its stage crew. So we are left to ask: when a republic crowns a king, does the crown change the king, or does the king change the republic into something else entirely? Story 7: The Mandate of Heaven, Cosmic Order, and the Rise of Chinese Dynasties. Where the Roman emperors cloaked themselves in divine robes and demanded loyalty from an exhausted Senate, ancient Chinese rulers justified their power differently, not by proclaiming themselves gods, but by presenting themselves as heaven's chosen instruments. This story explores a system of divine kingship that did not begin with self-deification, but with a philosophical and moral claim that rule should be based on virtue, and that heaven itself, the cosmic force known as Tian, Chinese letter, granted and withdrew the right to rule according to a dynasty's conduct. It was a system known as the Mandate of Heaven, Tianming, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Unlike hereditary divine kingship in Egypt or Europe, this mandate was conditional. It could be lost. It could justify rebellion. It could explain earthquakes, famines, and floods. And yet, despite being based on lofty ideals, it became a political instrument used by ambitious men to legitimize their conquests, reshape dynasties, and reinterpret history. In this first section, we begin with the fall of the Shang dynasty around 1046 BCE, and the revolutionary philosophy that the Zhou dynasty used to justify their rise, a philosophy that would shape over 3,000 years of Chinese imperial rule. The Shang dynasty, rule by ritual and blood. The Shang dynasty, c. 1600–1046 BCE, was the second recorded Chinese dynasty, emerging along the fertile Yellow River Valley. The Shang kings ruled through elaborate ancestor worship, oracle bone divination, military dominance, and harsh tribute systems. A priest-king model rooted in communication with spirits. The king was not yet son of heaven, but rather the high priest, interpreting divine will through burnt turtle shells and ox scapulae. These oracle bones contain the earliest written Chinese characters, and their inscriptions record the state's concern with omens, hunting, weather, and warfare. Shang kings legitimized their rule through ritual precision, not moral virtue. As long as they conducted the correct sacrifices, heaven was silent. But beneath the ornate bronzes and bone readings lay cracks. Late Shang rulers grew increasingly decadent. Tax burdens increased. Forced labor conscriptions alienated the population. Local tribal leaders began to resist. And in the western frontier, a rising power watched and waited. The Zhou, a frontier clan with a moral vision. The Zhou people were originally a semi-nomadic tribe located in the Wei River Valley, modern-day Shanxi. Though culturally similar to the Shang, they developed a more moralistic worldview, perhaps influenced by hardship and distance from the Shang court. By the 11th century BCE, the Zhou had grown in strength and began pushing back against Shang influence. Under the leadership of King Wen and later his son King Wu, they consolidated power, gained allies, and began to articulate a new theory of rule. Heaven sees with the eyes of the people. Heaven hears with the ears of the people. Book of Documents Shujing. This was revolutionary. Instead of viewing power as a hereditary right or divine bloodline, the Zhou proposed that heaven granted its mandate based on virtue. If a ruler failed to act justly, heaven would send signs disaster, famine, rebellion, and eventually allow his overthrow. The Battle of Mui, the overthrow of Shang. Around 1046 BCE, King Wu of Zhou led a coalition of tribal allies against the Shang ruler King Zhou, Dai Xin, a man portrayed in later histories as the embodiment of tyranny. He is accused of building a lake of wine and forcing nobles to drink themselves to death. He burned ministers alive for offering dissent. He entertained concubines while the people starved. How much of this is true is debated, but it mattered less than the narrative it created. At the Battle of Mui, the Zhou forces marched on the Shang capital. Despite being outnumbered, many Shang troops refused to fight, reportedly laying down their weapons. King Zhou of Shang set his palace on fire and committed suicide. It was not merely a military victory, it was presented as a cosmic correction. Heaven's mandate, a political theology. After the victory, the Zhou declared that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the Shang and bestowed it upon the Zhou. This was not just political spin, it was codified in ritual texts, oral traditions, and philosophical teachings. Tian heaven was now a moral force, not a personal god. The emperor became the son of heaven, Tianzi, a mortal who ruled on heaven's behalf. Dynastic change was not treason, but a natural consequence of moral failure. The Zhou kings instituted weekly sacrifices, moral reforms, and ritual codes to demonstrate their worthiness. They emphasized that the people's suffering was a sign of heaven's displeasure, not just poor governance. A new kind of king had arrived, not a god, but a moral servant of heaven. The Zhou bureaucracy delegated divine authority. To govern their expanded realm, the Zhou created a feudal structure. Land was granted to loyal families and tribal leaders, forming a network of vassals. Each vassal pledged ritual and military allegiance to the Zhou king. Governance was based on ritual manuals, seasonal rites, and ancestral hierarchies. It was a decentralized system, but one that kept power sacred. The king's role was to mediate between heaven and earth through ritual, divination, and moral example. His vassals, in turn, mirrored this system locally. The king did not claim omnipotence. Instead, his legitimacy depended on continuing signs of heaven's favor. Bountiful harvests, peaceful borders, loyal vassals, correct ritual performance. This gave the people and elites a measuring stick for kingship and a justification for rebellion if things went wrong. Signs of heaven's displeasure, natural disaster as political warning. In Zhou ideology, heaven spoke through nature. A solar eclipse could signal divine warning. Earthquakes suggested loss of harmony between ruler and cosmos. Locust plagues, floods, or prolonged droughts hinted at imperial failure. This wasn't superstition alone, it was a cosmic contract. If the ruler failed in his duties, heaven would respond not with lightning bolts, but with disruption of the natural order. This ideology placed a heavy burden on kingship. Unlike divine right monarchs in Europe, Zhou kings had to earn their right to rule continuously. It also made history cyclical. Dynasties would rise, lose virtue, face disaster, and fall each time, explained through the lens of heaven's shifting favor. Closing thought: a moral monarchy or a justification for war. The mandate of heaven was elegant in theory: rule through virtue, justified by the cosmos, accountable to the people through omens and outcomes. But it was also a tool of conquest. Every new dynasty would later claim that its predecessor had lost heaven's favor, and that they, the new rulers, had been chosen to restore balance. Was the mandate truly a moral compass? Or was it the most successful political slogan in history, giving every rebel a sacred cause? The Zhou dynasty laid the foundation for China's moral monarchy through the concept of the mandate of heaven. But like all lofty systems, it was soon tested by war, corruption, and contradiction. As the centralized Zhou state fragmented into rival kingdoms during the Eastern Zhou period, 770–256 BCE, the idea that virtue-justified rule was challenged on all sides. Might began to matter more than morality. Ritual gave way to warfare. And yet, amid this collapse, some of China's most enduring philosophers emerged not to abandon the mandate of heaven, but to redefine it. This section explores how thinkers like Confucius, Mencius, and Zunzi reshaped kingship into a moral craft, even as warlords carved the land into bloodied fiefdoms. It's a story of ideals under fire and the transformation of divine rule into an ethical bureaucracy. The Eastern Zhou and the Age of Division. In 771 BCE, the Zhou capital was sacked by invading tribes, forcing the dynasty to relocate east to Luoyang. This event marked the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period, traditionally divided into the Spring and Autumn period, 770–476 BCE, the Warring States period, 475–221 BCE. During this time, the Zhou kings lost real control. Regional lords, many former vassals, became de facto rulers, waging constant wars to expand territory. Yet these warlords continued to invoke the mandate of heaven. Each claimed heaven's blessing through battlefield success. Rituals were retained, even as morality crumbled. Propaganda and omens became tools of statecraft. The contradiction was clear. If heaven demanded virtue, why were the most violent states winning? Confucius, virtue over violence. Confuzi, known in the West as Confucius, c. 551–479 BCE, was born during the Spring and Autumn period, a time of decline, ritual nostalgia, and political cynicism. As a minor aristocrat in the state of Lu, Confucius served briefly in government, but became disillusioned by corruption. He spent much of his life teaching and writing about how rulers should behave. At the heart of his thought was the idea that the mandate of heaven was not a license to dominate, but a duty to model virtue. Key concepts included Ren Chinese letter, humaneness or benevolence. Li Chinese letter, ritual propriety, not mere ceremony but a system of social order. Zunzi Chinese letter, the noble person who governed through moral example. In Confucianism, the ideal ruler was not a warrior, but a moral sage who cultivated virtue and inspired obedience through goodness, not fear. He wrote, He who rules by virtue is like the North Star. It remains in place, while all the other stars revolve around it. Confucius did not reject the mandate of heaven. He reinterpreted it as ethical legitimacy. Mencius, rebellion as a moral right. Confucius, ideas were carried forward by Mencius Mengzi, c. 372–289 BCE, who took an even more radical stance. He argued that human nature was inherently good. He believed rulers must nurture the people, not exploit them. Most importantly, he declared that bad kings could be overthrown. In one famous exchange, Mencius was asked whether a subject could kill a tyrant. Q. Is it permissible to kill a king? A. He who acts as a tyrant is no king. This was a remarkable claim. The mandate of heaven was revocable by the people, and rebellion could be morally justified if the ruler lost virtue. Heaven, Mencius argued, spoke through the people. Heaven sees as the people see. Heaven hears as the people hear. This made kingship conditional not just in theology, but in social contract. It introduced the idea that political legitimacy depends on public welfare. Zunzi, order from discipline, not nature. Not all Confucians were idealists. Zunzi, c. 310–235 BCE, a later Confucian thinker, disagreed with Mencius. He believed that human nature was selfish and chaotic, and that virtue had to be taught, not innate. For Zunzi, ritual and law were necessary to control disorder. The ruler's authority came from maintaining order, not expressing love. Heaven was impersonal, it followed natural laws, not moral judgments. He rejected the supernatural view of heaven, arguing, heaven does not speak, it reveals its patterns through nature. Yet even Zunzi believed in moral government. He supported the idea that a ruler must behave with decorum or risk collapse. His students included Han Feizi, who helped lay the groundwork for legalism, a philosophy that would shape the brutal, efficient statecraft of the Qin dynasty. The mandate in practice, philosophy meets power. While philosophers refined theories of kingship, warlords and generals used heaven's mandate for pragmatic ends. In practice, warring states' rulers performed Confucian rituals to legitimize their rule, even while plotting assassinations. Success in battle was seen as evidence of heaven's support. Some kings staged earthquake omens to signal divine favor. The gap between ideology and reality widened. The Zhou kings still existed, but were politically irrelevant. New states like Qin, Chu, and Qi built bureaucracies and tax systems to rival modern states. Rebellion was not condemned, it was normalized as a test of heaven's will. In this era, the mandate of heaven became a rhetorical weapon, a way to claim power without needing hereditary lineage. Closing thought, idealism in a time of violence. The Eastern Zhou period is one of China's most intellectually rich eras. It birthed Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, and Moism. All were reactions to the same crisis, the failure of virtue in a system that claimed to value it. In theory, the mandate of heaven elevated morality above might. But in practice, violence became the arbiter of heaven's favor. So we must ask, can an ethical monarchy survive when power is easier to seize than virtue is to cultivate? The Zhou dynasty gave birth to the concept of the mandate of heaven, and philosophers like Confucius and Mencius expanded it into a moral political doctrine. But ideas alone do not preserve empires. They must be enforced, interpreted, and sometimes bent to serve the ambitions of men who seek power not just to govern but to endure. In this final section, we explore how the Qin and Han dynasties, China's first great empires, took the mandate of heaven from abstract theory to institutional doctrine. We'll look at how the mandate became embedded in the imperial state, enforced through bureaucracy, monitored through astrology, and revived through rebellion. What began as a justification for rebellion had, by the hand, become the very ideology used to suppress it. The Qin dynasty, power without virtue. In 221 BCE, the state of Qin, led by Huang Zheng, conquered the other warring states and declared the first unified Chinese empire. Huang Zheng assumed a new title, Qin Shi Huangdi, first emperor of Qin. The Qin rejected the feudalism of the Zhou and replaced it with a centralized bureaucracy, standardized laws, weights, and currency, harsh punishments and strict legal codes, massive state projects including roads, canals, and the early Great Wall. This was not governance by virtue, it was governance by efficiency and fear. The Qin adopted legalist principles, believing that human nature was corrupt and required strict control. Interestingly, the first emperor rarely invoked the mandate of heaven in traditional terms. He instead sought immortality, sent expeditions to find the elixir of life, and styled himself as a divine figure above the cycles of history. Yet his reign was short-lived. Rebellions broke out almost immediately after his death in 210 BCE. The Qin collapsed by 206 BCE, lasting only 15 years. The very efficiency that built the empire made it brittle. The Qin failed to cultivate loyalty, and when heaven appeared to turn against them through natural disasters and revolt, their fall was interpreted as divine rejection. The Han Dynasty, bureaucracy and belief. In the aftermath, Liu Bang, a peasant-born rebel leader, defeated rival warlords and founded the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE. Unlike the Qin, the Han emperors embraced the mandate of heaven fully. Liu Bang styled himself as the restorer of moral order. Confucianism was promoted as the state ideology. Rituals, omens, and celestial observations became tools of statecraft. The Han emperors maintained centralized control, but balanced legalist administration with Confucian morality. This blend became the hallmark of imperial China. The emperor became both autocrat and moral exemplar, the son of heaven who ruled not by divine blood, but by merit and ritual correctness. Signs from heaven, natural disasters as political feedback. During the Han, the belief that heaven communicated through nature became institutionalized. Astrologers were employed at court to monitor the stars for omens. Historians recorded celestial anomalies, eclipses, comets, earthquakes, and tied them to political events. Emperors issued public confessions, zui jai, when disasters occurred, taking responsibility and promising reform. This was not just superstition, it was governance through ritual humility. A drought was not just a climate event, it was a sign that the emperor had failed in his duties. Floods meant loss of virtue. Even solar eclipses were interpreted as cosmic warnings. In a world without mass communication, these interpretations served a powerful political purpose. They reminded the ruler and the people that power was conditional. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, mandate as a weapon. By the late 2nd century CE, the Han dynasty had grown weak. Eunuchs dominated the court. Corruption plagued the provinces. Peasants faced heavy taxation and famine. In 184 CE, a millenarian Taoist sect led by Zhang Ju launched the Yellow Turban Rebellion. They wore yellow scarves and claimed the mandate of heaven had passed to a new, heavenly kingdom of great peace. Zhang Ju's slogan was, "The blue heaven is dead, the yellow heaven will rise. The year is at the Jiazi, fortune lies in the world anew." He wasn't just rebelling, he was claiming cosmic legitimacy. The rebellion was suppressed, but it weakened the Han beyond repair. In the decades that followed, China fractured into warlord states. The cycle had turned again. Dynastic cycle, rise, decline, fall, repeat. By the post-Han period, the dynastic cycle became codified in Chinese historiography. A virtuous dynasty gains the mandate of heaven. The dynasty prospers. Corruption and decline set in. Natural disasters and rebellion emerge. The mandate is withdrawn. A new dynasty rises. This model served both as a warning to rulers and a blueprint for rebels. It was taught in schools, embedded in official histories, and used to explain every major political shift for centuries. From the Tang to the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing, the story was the same. Rulers claimed heaven's blessing, lost virtue over time, faced revolt, and were replaced often by leaders who said they had received the mandate themselves. Even foreign dynasties like the Mongol Yuan and Manchu Qing adopted the rhetoric. To rule China, they needed not only force, but moral and cosmic approval. A mandate for modernity. Though the last Chinese emperor abdicated in 1912, the legacy of the mandate of heaven did not vanish. In early Republican China, leaders invoked the people's will as a new form of heaven. Communist narratives replaced heaven with history, but still justified revolution as necessary and morally correct. Even in contemporary governance, a focus on performance legitimacy, economic growth, social stability echoes the ancient idea that rulers must produce harmony to retain power. The language has changed, but the rhythm remains. The mandate of heaven was more than an ancient belief, it was a flexible political technology, one that allowed for monarchy without absolutism, rebellion without nihilism, and history without finality. Final reflection: does the mandate ever end? Unlike the divine right of kings in Europe, the mandate of heaven did not claim eternal authority. It was a conditional contract, a moral burden, and a political opportunity. It gave emperors immense power, but reminded them they could fall. It justified peasant uprisings, but only if they succeeded. And it offered a cyclical, rather than linear, view of history, one in which no rule was permanent, and every ruler was accountable to forces beyond himself. So we end this story not with a period, but a question. In a world still shaped by performance, legitimacy, and the moral judgment of leaders, has the mandate of heaven truly disappeared, or has it simply changed its name?